My mother sent me a bill for $467,000 on Mother's Day. The document was titled, "The Cost of Raising a Disappointment." She did not just send it to me privately. She broadcast it to our entire family group chat, exposing me to 26 relatives. So I replied with a single photograph. The next morning, 25 of them blocked her. The 26th person was my grandmother, and she did something far worse to my mother. My name is Julia. I am 33 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to tear you down. It was exactly 9 in the morning on Mother's Day. I was standing in the kitchen of my Chicago apartment. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It cast a warm, golden glow over the hardwood floors. I had just finished brewing a fresh pot of coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, making the quiet morning feel peaceful and safe. I lived alone, and I liked it that way. My life was structured and predictable. I had spent years building a successful career from the ground up. I worked hard to distance myself from the constant chaos and emotional manipulation of my childhood home. I took a sip of my coffee and looked out at the city skyline. I was planning to call my mother Linda later that afternoon. It was an obligatory call, the kind you make out of duty rather than genuine affection. I had even ordered an expensive flower arrangement to be delivered to her house. I thought that would be enough to keep the peace for another year. I was entirely wrong about that. My phone buzzed heavily on the cold granite countertop. The sudden vibration startled me in the quiet apartment. I picked it up expecting a text message from a friend or an urgent email from a client. Instead, I saw a notification from the Anderson Family Network. This was our massive family group chat. It included 26 extended relatives. There were aunts and uncles from both sides of the country. There were cousins I had not seen in a decade. There were even a few family friends who had somehow been added over the long years. I usually kept the chat muted. It was mostly filled with holiday greetings or recipes that nobody actually cooked. But today, there was a brand new message from my mother. It was not a happy Mother's Day wish. It was not a picture of the beautiful flowers I had sent. It was a digital file attachment. The file was a portable document format. The title of the document made my breath catch sharply in my throat. It literally read, "The Cost of Raising a Disappointment." For a long moment, I just stared blindly at the screen. My heart began to pound rapidly against my ribs. My hands felt suddenly freezing cold. I knew my mother was cruel. I knew she absolutely loved a captive audience. But this felt completely different. This felt highly calculated and dangerous. I tapped the glass screen to open the document. What I saw made my stomach drop into my shoes. It was a highly stylized invoice. It looked exactly like something a professional corporate billing department would send. It had my mother's full name and home address printed at the top. Below that, it listed my personal name as the debtor. The invoice was itemized with meticulous and terrifying precision. There were perfectly aligned columns for the date, the description of the expense, and the total amount owed. I scrolled down the bright page, completely frozen in deep disbelief. She had maliciously billed me for absolutely everything. And I truly mean everything. The very first line item was for my childhood braces. She had listed the exact out-of-pocket cost from 20 years ago. The next line was for basic household groceries. She had somehow calculated a weekly food allowance for the entire 18 years I lived under her roof and multiplied it by 12 months. There were ridiculous charges for basic school supplies and winter coats. There were unreasonable fees for driving me to normal extracurricular activities. She had even billed me for the electricity and running water I consumed as a growing child. But the sheer cruelty did not stop at basic living expenses. She had moved on to my higher education. There was a massive financial charge listed for community college tuition. This particular line made my blood boil with intense fury. I had paid for my own community college classes. I had worked 2 exhausting minimum wage jobs. I waited dirty tables until 2 in the morning and woke up at 6 to study for my exams. My mother had never contributed a single dime to my education fund. She had told me that paying for college was not her responsibility because I had not chosen a prestigious university like my older brother Cameron. Yet here she was publicly billing me for the money I had earned with my own sweat and tears. It was a blatant lie broadcast to our entire family tree. I kept scrolling downward, unable to look away from the digital train wreck on my screen. The final line item was easily the most disturbing of them all. It was explicitly labeled emotional damages for failing to secure a high-earning husband. I read those awful words 3 separate times. My mother had always measured my personal worth by my ability to attract wealth. She despised the fact that I chose to build my own independent career instead of marrying into a rich family. She truly hated that I was financially autonomous. She had literally assigned a monetary value to her deep disappointment in my independent life choices. At the very bottom of the document was the grand total. It was printed in a bold, bright red font to ensure nobody missed it. $467,000. Right below that staggering number was a public message directly addressed to the entire group chat. It read, "Since Julia refuses to honor her mother today with a proper gift, I am officially calling in her lifelong debt. Pay up by Friday or be permanently removed from this family." I set my phone down gently on the counter. The silence in my apartment was absolutely deafening. I felt a strong wave of nausea wash over my entire body. My mother had just humiliated me in front of 26 people. She had exposed our private family dysfunction to cousins and aunts who barely even knew me. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar feeling of deep worthlessness that usually followed her vicious attacks. But the tears never arrived. Instead, my mind shifted into a completely different gear. I am a forensic accountant. My entire professional career is built on finding the hidden truth inside messy numbers. I track down stolen hidden assets. I expose massive financial corporate fraud. I look at confusing spreadsheets and find the dark stories that desperate people are trying to hide. And as I stared blankly at the number on my glowing screen, something clicked sharply in my professional brain. $467,000. It was an incredibly specific and odd number. When people fabricate emotional debts or try to illegally extort money, they usually pick clean round figures. They ask for $500,000. They ask for $100,000. They want the dramatic theatrical impact of a clean, massive number. They absolutely do not ask for $467,000 unless that exact amount means something very real. A highly specific number means a highly specific real-world debt. My mother did not pull that strange figure out of thin air. She actually needed exactly $467,000. She needed it incredibly quickly. She needed it by this coming Friday. The public shaming was not just about her usual cruelty. It was a desperate, panicked tactic to force my hand. She was trying to panic me into writing a massive check. She was using the heavy social pressure of the entire extended family to actively extort me. My phone vibrated violently again. The relatives were waking up across different time zones. Aunt Martha sent a long message saying how deeply disappointed she was in my current behavior. Uncle Thomas chimed in eagerly, agreeing with my mother. They falsely accused me of being an ungrateful and terrible child. I stared at the screen. I ignored the painful accusations and focused purely on the numbers. I had a mystery to solve today, and I was going to solve it. The notifications arrived in rapid succession. My phone buzzed so violently against the cold granite counter that it began to inch toward the edge. I stood perfectly still, watching the screen light up with name after name. Aunt Martha was the first to unleash her harsh judgment. She typed a massive paragraph about how I had cruelly abandoned my sweet mother the very moment I moved to Chicago. She claimed my corporate job had made me arrogant and completely cold. She said I owed my mother everything because Linda had sacrificed her youth to raise me. She demanded that I show some basic respect and pay what I owed to the woman who gave me life. Uncle Thomas chimed in right after her. He demanded that I apologize immediately and wire the funds by the end of the day. He called me a selfish, ungrateful daughter who cared more about city living than family loyalty. He reminded me that family is the only thing that matters in this world, and that I was destroying ours. Then came Cousin Rebecca. She sent 3 angry messages in a row. She accused me of thinking I was better than everyone else just because I lived in a high-rise apartment. She said my mother was crying and shaking, and that I was breaking her heart on the most important day of the entire year. The messages piled up like a digital avalanche. 26 people were watching this public execution. Most of them were joining in eagerly. A few remained silent, but their silence was just another painful form of complicity. Growing up, I would have completely shattered under this kind of coordinated attack. I would have called my mother in tears, begging for forgiveness for a crime I did not commit. I would have scrambled to make things right, to smooth over the heavy tension, to be the good, quiet daughter she constantly demanded. But I was not that scared little girl anymore. The toxic guilt they were trying to force on me simply did not stick. I read their vicious words and felt a profound sense of detachment. They did not know the real Linda. They only knew the carefully crafted victim persona she presented at family barbecues and holiday dinners. They did not know about the relentless emotional abuse behind closed doors. They did not know she had never paid a single dime toward my college tuition or my living expenses. They were perfectly willing to blindly attack me because it was easier than questioning the powerful family matriarch. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a response. I did not type out an angry defense. I did not try to correct their totally false narrative. Arguing with flying monkeys only feeds the drama. It gives them the exact fuel they need to keep the fire burning brightly. Instead, I took a deep breath and let the digital noise fade into the background. I needed to focus on the one detail in that ridiculous invoice that actually mattered. I scrolled back up past the hateful comments and focused my eyes on the original document. I stared at the bold red font at the bottom of the glowing screen. $467,000. I let that precise number echo in my mind. 467,000. In my line of work, you learn very quickly how to spot a lie. Liars have distinct, predictable patterns. When people fabricate financial claims out of thin air, they gravitate toward clean, round numbers. They want the shock value of a massive figure. If my mother simply wanted to punish me and cause a dramatic scene, she would have demanded $500,000. She would have billed me for an even 500,000. It is basic human nature to round up when you are trying to be theatrical and cruel. But $467,000 is an incredibly messy number. It is awkwardly specific. It lacks the punchy drama of a round $250,000 or $500,000. You do not accidentally generate a number like that when you are typing up a fake invoice to shame your daughter on Mother's Day. As a forensic accountant, that specific number was a massive glowing red flag. It sang to me like a warning siren. It told me a story that my mother was desperately trying to hide. A highly specific number means a highly specific ledger. It means there is a real-world debt attached to that exact amount. My mother did not make that number up to hurt my feelings. She actually needed exactly $467,000, and she needed it by Friday. That was the second glaring red flag. She had given me a strict, non-negotiable deadline. Extortionists only set hard deadlines when they are backed into a dangerous corner. If this was just about emotional manipulation, there would be no immediate rush. She could drag the painful drama out for months or even years. But Friday meant a real-world consequence was looming over her head. Friday meant a bill was coming due, or a bank was foreclosing, or an auditor was arriving. My mother was terrified. The public shaming in the group chat was not a display of power. It was a display of absolute panic. She was using the heavy social pressure of the entire extended family as a blunt instrument to force my hand quickly. She was hoping I would be so humiliated and broken by the collective family outrage that I would blindly write a massive check just to make the public embarrassment stop. She was counting on my childhood trauma to override my professional logic and training. She severely underestimated me. I picked up my phone and opened the settings menu. With a few quick taps, I muted the Anderson Family Network group chat entirely. The violent buzzing finally stopped. The silence returned to my sunlit kitchen. The peace was instantly restored. I poured my coffee into a ceramic mug and carried it over to my kitchen island. I opened my laptop and powered it on. The bright screen illuminated my face. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter caught in a complicated web of toxic family dynamics. I was a professional investigator stepping onto a fresh crime scene. If my mother needed exactly $467,000 by Friday, she had clearly made a catastrophic financial mistake. Linda was always obsessed with maintaining the appearance of immense wealth. She drove luxury cars and wore expensive designer clothes. She constantly bragged about her pristine credit score and her perfectly managed investment portfolios. She looked down on anyone who carried debt. For her to suddenly need nearly $500,000 in cash meant her entire financial facade was secretly crumbling. I needed to find out where the structural damage began. I opened a new secure browser window and pulled up the public county property records for her district. Real estate is always the first place people go when they are desperate for fast cash. It is the easiest major asset to leverage. I typed in her home address. The familiar street name brought a brief flash of painful childhood memories, but I pushed them away quickly. I clicked on the search button and waited for the database to load. The blue progress bar inched across the top of the screen. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. The caffeine sharpened my focus. When the property records finally appeared, I started scanning the dense columns of legal text. I looked at the long history of deeds and titles. I checked for recent liens or property transfers. I was looking for anything out of the ordinary, anything that signaled a sudden, urgent need for cash. The first few entries were completely normal. The original purchase deed from 30 years ago. A routine refinancing from 15 years ago. A local permit for a minor kitchen renovation. Everything looked perfectly stable and boring. I took another sip of coffee and kept reading. I was determined to find the crack in her foundation. I knew it had to be there somewhere. People do not send unhinged extortion letters to their children unless they have exhausted all other logical options. She was out of money and out of time. I just had to find the paper trail that proved it. I scrolled down the page, preparing to dig deeper into the digital archives. The family noise was entirely blocked out. It was just me and the numbers now. And I always win when it comes to numbers. The harsh morning sunlight reflected off the towering glass facade of my corporate building in downtown Chicago. I walked through the revolving doors with a brisk and measured pace. My tailored charcoal suit acted as my daily armor. My leather briefcase felt heavy, but grounding in my right hand. The lobby was a massive expanse of polished white marble and brushed steel. It was a cathedral of high finance and corporate law. Hundreds of professionals moved with silent purpose. The air smelled faintly of expensive espresso and crisp dry cleaning. This was my sanctuary. This was the world I had conquered entirely on my own. I approached the security turnstiles, retrieving my access badge from my pocket. Before I could swipe my card, a loud and abrasive voice echoed across the pristine marble floor. It shattered the quiet professional murmur of the morning commute. "Julia, do not even try to walk away from me." I froze. My hand stopped halfway to the electronic scanner. I recognized that arrogant, demanding tone instantly. I turned slowly, feeling a sudden spike of adrenaline course through my veins. Striding aggressively across the lobby was my older brother Cameron. He looked entirely out of place in this environment. He was 35 years old, but he still dressed like a college student, trying to impress a venture capitalist. He wore a brightly colored blazer over a designer graphic t-shirt. His expensive sneakers squeaked loudly against the polished stone. He wore an oversized luxury watch that I knew for a fact he could not actually afford. He had the unmistakable aura of a man who desperately wanted everyone to believe he was a massive success. He was the golden child of our family. He was the self-proclaimed startup entrepreneur who had never actually produced a single profitable product. He must have tailgated someone through the outer security doors. Now he was marching directly toward me with his face flushed red with unearned righteous anger. "Did you really think you could just ignore Mom's messages and hide in your little cubicle?" Cameron demanded. His voice was entirely too loud. Several lawyers holding briefcases stopped to stare at the sudden commotion. "Keep your voice down, Cameron," I said evenly. My tone was icy and controlled. "You are in a professional environment. How did you even get in here? I walked in because I am your brother and you are destroying our family." He sneered, stopping just inches away from me. He tried to use his height to intimidate me. It was the same physical bullying tactic he used when we were teenagers. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Look at you, playing the big corporate executive. You think this boring desk job makes you better than us. You think wearing a gray suit means you can disrespect the woman who gave you life." I stared back at him without blinking. I felt absolutely no fear. The little girl who used to cower when her older brother yelled was long gone. "I am not playing anything," I replied calmly. "I am a senior forensic accountant at a top-tier firm. I earn every single thing I have. What exactly are you playing at today, Cameron? Did your latest fake business venture fail again?" His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed with pure venom. "Do not deflect, Julia. This is about your disgusting behavior on Mother's Day. Mom is a complete wreck. She is crying uncontrollably. You embarrassed her in front of the entire family by ignoring her simple request. You were always like this. You were always the plain invisible burden who contributed nothing. You just sat in the corner and soaked up resources while I was actually building a legacy. You owe her that money." The sheer audacity of his statement was almost breathtaking. He had fully bought into the toxic delusion our mother had constructed. He truly believed he was the brilliant star of the family, while I was just an ugly, useless shadow. I let out a short, bitter laugh. The sound echoed sharply in the cavernous lobby. An invisible burden. "Is that what I was?" I asked, stepping 1 inch closer to him. "Yes, you are a selfish disappointment," Cameron hissed. "You ran away to the city and abandoned your real obligations." "I did not run away. I escaped," I said. My voice was low and lethal. "And since we are discussing financial obligations, let us talk about your legacy, Cameron. Let us talk about how you built your so-called empire." He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I am a founder. I take risks. You just crunch numbers for a paycheck. You have no idea what it takes to be a visionary." "I know exactly what it takes," I countered smoothly. "It takes a massive amount of unearned cash, cash that you never had. Do you want to know what my boring desk job actually accomplished? My boring desk job paid your downtown rent for 3 straight years." Cameron's arrogant smirk faltered slightly. His eyes darted to the left and right. "Do not try to deny it." I continued, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "From 2016 to 2019, I wired exactly $2,400 every single month to your landlord. I paid for that luxury loft because your revolutionary tech startup could not even generate enough revenue to keep your electricity on. I funded your visionary lifestyle while you sat around drinking craft beer and pretending to be the next major tech giant." "Keep your voice down," Cameron muttered, his face suddenly turning a dark shade of crimson. A few people waiting for the elevators were openly listening to our conversation now. "You wanted to have this conversation in public," I reminded him without breaking eye contact. "So let us keep going. You call me a burden, but I subsidized your entire adult life. I paid for the groceries you ate while you were finding yourself. I covered the car insurance on that absurd sports car you leased to look successful. You are not an entrepreneur, Cameron. You are a 35-year-old dependent, and my boring desk job was your sole source of venture capital." He stepped back as if I had physically struck him. The golden child illusion was completely shattering right here in the lobby of my firm. He was stripped of his armor and left with nothing but his own embarrassing failures. But instead of feeling shame, he quickly pivoted to blind rage. His fragile ego could not handle the exposure. "You ungrateful witch," he spat. His hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. "You think throwing a few dollars my way gives you the right to treat Mom like garbage? She is sick, Julia. You are causing her blood pressure to spike dangerously high. She is on the verge of a massive heart attack because you refuse to pay your debts. She does not have a debt to collect from me, I stated firmly. I owe her nothing. That invoice is a complete fabrication. You will write that check today, Cameron demanded loudly. His voice echoed off the marble walls again. His face was twisted with ugly desperation. You will wire that $467,000 by Friday, or I swear to God I will ruin you. I tilted my head, studying his frantic behavior. You will ruin me. And how exactly do you plan to do that? I will march right up to your managing partner's office, he threatened, pointing a shaking finger at the elevator banks. I will tell them that their precious senior accountant is financially abusing her sick elderly mother. I will tell them you are stealing from your own family. I will make such a massive scene in this lobby that security will have to drag you out. I will destroy your professional reputation before lunch. You will be completely unemployable. His threat was pathetic, but his erratic behavior was becoming a genuine security risk. He was breathing heavily and sweating through his expensive blazer. He looked like a man who was fighting for his actual life. I slowly turned my head and made eye contact with the head security guard standing near the front desk. His name was David, and he had been watching the entire exchange with increasing concern. I gave David a subtle nod. He immediately unhooked his radio and began walking briskly toward us, accompanied by another large guard in a dark uniform. You are not going upstairs, Cameron, I said calmly, turning back to my brother. You are leaving this building right now. And if you ever show your face at my workplace again, I will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. You cannot do this to us, Cameron shouted as David and the second guard stepped up behind him. One guard placed a firm hand on Cameron's shoulder, guiding him away from me. Let go of me. I am a guest, Cameron yelled, shrugging aggressively against the guard's grip. Sir, you need to exit the premises immediately, David said in a deep, authoritative tone. If you resist, we will involve the police. Cameron realized he had lost. The security guards were physically overpowering him. He was being forcibly removed from the building in front of dozens of my professional colleagues. His grand ambush had failed spectacularly. I had not broken down in tears. I had not agreed to write the check. I had simply humiliated him with the undeniable truth. As the guards pushed him toward the revolving glass doors, Cameron dug his heels into the polished floor. He twisted his body to look back at me one final time. His eyes were wide and frantic. The mask of the arrogant golden child had completely melted away. He looked terrified. You have to pay it, Julia, he screamed across the lobby. The desperation in his voice sent a sudden sharp chill down my spine. Mom's house is on the line because of you. She is going to lose everything if you do not pay up. The heavy glass doors rotated, pushing him out into the bustling city street. The guards stood firm at the entrance, ensuring he did not attempt to come back inside. The lobby slowly returned to its normal quiet hum. People turned their attention back to their phones and their morning coffees. I stood frozen by the turnstiles. My access badge was gripped tightly in my hand. Mom's house is on the line because of you. The words echoed loudly in my mind. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to connect. The bizarre, highly specific invoice. The aggressive Mother's Day deadline. Cameron's sudden, frantic demand for cash. It was not just about control or emotional abuse anymore. It was about something much larger. My mother owned her large suburban house outright. She had paid off the primary mortgage over a decade ago. She bragged about being completely debt-free at every single family gathering. She used her paid-off house as a weapon to judge everyone else who had a monthly mortgage payment. If her house was suddenly on the line, it meant she had secretly borrowed against it. It meant she had taken out a massive loan using her only major asset as collateral. And if Cameron was this terrified about her losing it, it meant he was somehow deeply involved in whatever financial disaster she had created. I swiped my badge against the electronic scanner. The glass barrier slid open with a soft beep. I walked toward the elevator banks with a new sense of fierce determination. I did not care about the drama or the insults. I only cared about the numbers. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to look at the public property records immediately. I was going to find out exactly how much debt my mother had secretly taken on. The truth was hiding in the data, and I was about to uncover it all. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor felt entirely different today. Usually, I use these 60 seconds of ascending silence to mentally prepare for my corporate clients. I would review tax codes and prepare audit strategies. But today, my mind was completely consumed by a domestic financial disaster. Cameron had handed me the skeleton key to my mother's desperate extortion attempt. "Mom's house is on the line." I repeated the phrase under my breath. I stepped off the elevator and walked swiftly past the reception desk. I gave a polite nod to my colleagues, but I did not stop for the usual morning pleasantries. I entered my private corner office and firmly shut the heavy oak door behind me. The click of the lock provided a satisfying sense of absolute isolation. I set my leather briefcase on the floor and walked straight to my desk. I did not even bother taking off my suit jacket. I woke up my workstation monitors. The screens flared to life, illuminating my face with a harsh blue light. I opened my secure web browser and navigated directly to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds online portal. As I typed in my mother's full legal name and her suburban address, my professional training took complete control. My mother, Linda, was a woman who practically worshipped her own financial independence. She had paid off the 30-year mortgage on her 4-bedroom colonial house over a decade ago. It was her absolute crowning achievement. She weaponized that paid-off house at every single social gathering. Whenever a relative complained about interest rates or property taxes, Linda would adopt a sickeningly sweet smile and remind everyone that she owned her property free and clear. She treated debt like it was a moral failing. She looked down on anyone who owed money to a bank. For a woman with that level of extreme financial pride to put her beloved house on the line, something catastrophic must have occurred. The database search engine took a few agonizing seconds to process my request. I watched the small loading icon spin in circles. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I knew the history of this property. I knew the original deed was filed in 1992. I knew the final mortgage satisfaction document was recorded in 2012. I expected to see those familiar historical records pop up on my screen. The page finally refreshed. A long list of legal documents appeared in chronological order. I scrolled past the old utility easements and the original property transfer files. I dragged my cursor to the very top of the list to look at the most recent filings. My eyes locked onto a document recorded just 18 months ago. My heart executed a hard, violent thump against my ribs. It was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC. I clicked the link to download the scanned PDF image of the actual legal document. The image loaded onto my secondary monitor. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. There it was, in stark black and white. My mother's distinct looping signature was inked across the bottom of the page. She had pledged her pristine, debt-free home as collateral to secure a massive line of credit from a major national bank. She had willingly mortgaged her most prized possession. She had violated her own sacred rule about carrying debt. I scanned the terms of the loan agreement. The interest rate was terrible, indicating she had likely been in a rush to secure the funds. The timeline was aggressive. But the most alarming part was the second document filed right above the HELOC in the county database. It was filed just 3 weeks ago. It was a notice of default and intention to foreclose. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and let out a long, slow breath. Cameron was not exaggerating. He was not being dramatic. Mom's house was literally on the line. The bank had initiated formal foreclosure proceedings. She had missed multiple consecutive payments, and the lender was now moving aggressively to seize the property. She was legally on the brink of losing her home. If she did not cure the default within the grace period, the bank would auction her beloved colonial house to the highest bidder. Her pristine suburban image was about to be completely incinerated. This was the terrifying reality that drove her to create that unhinged Mother's Day invoice. She was staring down the barrel of homelessness and profound social humiliation. She needed a massive injection of cash to satisfy the bank and stop the foreclosure. She thought she could bully and shame her successful daughter into writing a blank check to save the family matriarch. But as I stared at the financial figures printed on the notice of default, the cold logic of my profession interrupted my train of thought. A massive glaring inconsistency jumped off the screen and smacked me right in the face. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me and uncapped my favorite fountain pen. I needed to write the numbers down to see them clearly. The maximum limit of the home equity line of credit my mother took out was exactly $200,000. The notice of default stated that the principal balance owed to the bank was exactly $200,000. She had completely maxed out the credit line. She had drawn every single available penny from the bank. I wrote $200,000 on the top line of my yellow pad. I drew a thick black box around it. Then I wrote the total amount from the fake Mother's Day invoice right below it. $467,000. I stared at the two numbers. The math simply did not work. If my mother only needed to pay off the defaulted HELOC to save her house, she only needed $200,000. Even accounting for late fees and legal penalties, the bank would demand a number very close to that baseline figure. If she was trying to extort me to save her property, she would have demanded $200,000. She would have billed me for the exact amount required to halt the foreclosure, but she demanded $467,000. I tapped my pen against the desk. The sound was sharp and rhythmic in the quiet office. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to look for the missing pieces in a financial puzzle. When the numbers do not reconcile, it means there is an entirely separate ledger hiding in the shadows. It means the crisis is much bigger than the visible documentation suggests. I did the simple subtraction in my head, but I wrote it out on the pad just to solidify the reality. 467,000 minus 200,000 equals 267,000. $267,000. That was the massive gaping hole in my mother's financial story. The defaulted HELOC proved she was in severe financial ruin, but it only accounted for less than half of the money she was desperately demanding from me. The extortion attempt was not just about saving her house, it was about covering a much larger and darker catastrophe. Where did the remaining $267,000 come from? And more importantly, where did it go? My mind raced through the possibilities. Did she have secret gambling debts? Did she fall victim to a massive wire fraud scam? Did she owe money to private lenders who did not file public property liens? None of those scenarios fit her psychological profile. Linda was fiercely protective of her image. She did not gamble. She was deeply suspicious of online transactions, and she would never associate with unsavory private lenders. Whatever generated this massive secondary debt had to be connected to her intense need to maintain her status as the perfect, successful matriarch. I looked back at the computer screen. I pulled up the HELOC document again and looked closely at the dates. She took out the $200,000 loan exactly 18 months ago. What was happening 18 months ago? I closed my eyes and searched my memory. I thought back to the sparse family updates I had received before I muted the group chat. I thought about the holiday newsletters my mother loved to send out bragging about her golden child. 18 months ago was exactly when Cameron launched his revolutionary tech startup. My eyes snapped open. A cold wave of realization washed over me. Cameron had bragged endlessly about securing seed funding for his new company. He had bought expensive office space downtown. He had leased luxury company cars. He had flown to fake conferences in Dubai and Tokyo. He had lived the life of a Silicon Valley billionaire without ever having a functional product to sell. I had assumed he found some foolish angel investors to scam. I had assumed he conned a venture capital firm into backing his vaporware. But Cameron was not a persuasive businessman. He was an arrogant dependent who had relied on my secret rent payments for 3 years. Institutional investors do not hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars to men like Cameron without doing severe due diligence. But a doting narcissistic mother would. My mother had mortgaged her completely paid-off home to fund Cameron's fake startup. She had leveraged her ultimate status symbol to finance her golden child's delusion. That explained the $200,000 HELOC perfectly. but it still did not explain the missing $267,000. If Cameron burned through the initial $200,000 from the house loan, he would have inevitably come back for more. He always needed more. His fake billionaire lifestyle was incredibly expensive to maintain. When the HELOC ran dry, my mother would have been forced to find another source of immediate liquid cash to keep his startup illusion alive. But Linda had no other major assets. She had no other properties to leverage. Her retirement accounts were modest because she had always relied on my late father's life insurance policy, which was long gone. There was only one other pool of significant wealth left in our entire family. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. It was a thought so dark and twisted that my mind initially rejected it. But the cold, hard numbers refused to lie. The math demanded a source. I stood up from my desk. My chair rolled backward and bumped against the bookshelf. My heart was pounding fiercely now, not from shock, but from a deeply terrifying understanding of exactly how far my mother had fallen. The missing $267,000 had to come from somewhere, and I was suddenly absolutely certain I knew exactly where she stole it from. I grabbed my suit jacket from the back of my chair and slipped it on. The investigation had just escalated from a simple case of personal extortion to a massive federal crime. I needed to move fast. I needed to start pulling the bank wire transfers. The truth was hiding in the routing numbers, and I was going to rip it completely out of the shadows. My mother thought she was a master manipulator, but she was leaving a digital blood trail a mile wide, and I was the exact wrong daughter to challenge to a game of numbers. I grabbed my briefcase and headed for the door. The hunt was officially on. I stepped out of the corporate building and hailed a cab to head back to my home office setup where my secure servers were located. The crisp Chicago wind whipped past me, but I barely felt the cold. My blood was practically humming with adrenaline. As I settled into the back seat of the taxi, my phone suddenly erupted. It was not the standard polite vibration of a text message. It was a relentless, sustained buzzing. I pulled the device from my coat pocket and watched the screen light up with a fresh wave of unhinged hostility. The temporary peace I had secured by muting the group chat was completely shattered. My mother had realized that her initial tactic was failing. I had not broken down in tears, and I had not wired her the money. Cameron had clearly called her from the street to report his humiliating defeat in my lobby. Like any cornered predator, Linda was now escalating the attack to catastrophic new levels. She was unleashing the full toxic weight of the entire extended family. I unlocked my phone and tapped open the Anderson Family Network chat. Linda had posted a massive multi-paragraph manifesto. She had dropped all pretense of the fake invoice being about emotional damages or childhood braces. She was now publicly weaponizing her impending financial ruin, but twisting the narrative to make me the sole cause of her destruction. Her message was a masterpiece of pure manipulation. She wrote that my cruel and sudden refusal to honor my family debts was going to force her directly onto the streets. She claimed she was losing the family home because she had generously drained her savings to support my supposedly lavish lifestyle in the city. She painted a pathetic theatrical picture of an elderly mother being brutally evicted by heartless bankers, all because her wealthy corporate daughter refused to spare a tiny fraction of her vast fortune. She ended the dramatic post with a direct plea for salvation. She told the 26 relatives in the chat that she was packing her belongings into cardboard boxes as she typed. She claimed she would be living in her car by the end of the week. The group chat members swallowed the lie without a single ounce of critical thinking. The digital attack rapidly spilled over from the text thread into direct personal assaults. My phone began ringing back to back. I watched the names flash across the screen. Aunt Carol, Uncle Richard, Cousin David. I refused to answer a single one of them. I let every call go straight to voicemail. When the ringing finally paused, I clicked on the voicemail inbox. I pressed play on the first message. It was Aunt Carol. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with absolute disgust. She called me a cold-blooded sociopath. She screamed into the receiver that she was utterly ashamed to share my bloodline. She demanded to know how I could sleep at night in my luxury high-rise while my own mother prepared to sleep on the cold concrete streets. She threatened to come to Chicago and drag me to the bank herself if I did not wire the funds immediately. The next message was from Uncle Richard. He did not yell, but his quiet disappointment was designed to cut much deeper. He told me I was a selfish monster who had abandoned her roots. He said I was single-handedly killing the woman who gave me life. He commanded me to write the check today or consider myself entirely dead to the family. There were 14 voicemails in total. Each one was more vicious and unhinged than the last. They called me heartless. They called me an arrogant corporate drone. They accused me of hoarding millions of dollars while watching my family starve. They had been perfectly programmed by my mother to execute a synchronized psychological assault. It was a textbook flying monkey maneuver. Linda sat safely in the center of the web, pulling the strings while her relatives did all the dirty work. Just as I thought the smear campaign had reached its absolute peak, a new notification popped up on my screen. It was an automated alert from a social media platform. My cousin David had tagged me in a public post. I clicked the link and felt my jaw tighten. My mother had actually set up a GoFundMe campaign. She had not just kept this toxic drama contained to our private family circle. She had broadcast it to the entire internet. I stared at the campaign page in pure disbelief. The title of the fundraiser was Help Save a Devoted Mother from Sudden Eviction. The goal was set to exactly $467,000. The main image on this campaign page was a carefully curated photograph of Linda standing in front of her pristine colonial house. She was wearing an old, faded sweater I had never seen before and looking deliberately mournful. The description below the photo was a breathtaking work of pure fiction. Linda wrote a long, tragic story about how she was a devoted widow who had sacrificed her entire life savings to put her ungrateful daughter through college. She claimed that this same daughter had now become a massively wealthy corporate executive in Chicago. The story alleged that I had made a firm promise to take care of my mother in her old age, but had suddenly and maliciously broken that promise, leaving her drowning in unexpected medical and housing debt. She explicitly stated that her heartless daughter abandoned her to face foreclosure alone. She begged her friends, her church members, and complete strangers to donate whatever they could spare to stop the bank from seizing her home on Friday. She wrote that any small donation would help ease the crushing pain of a mother's broken heart. The campaign had already raised $3,000 in just 2 hours. People from her local community were leaving sympathetic comments and tagging me, demanding to know how I could be so cruel. Strangers were calling me a monster on a public forum. She was actively crowdsourcing her extortion attempt. She was using the threat of total public humiliation to force me to cave. The sheer weight of the psychological pressure was immense. It was designed to be completely suffocating. For a normal person standing at the center of this coordinated smear campaign, the instinct to surrender would be entirely overwhelming. Most people would write the check just to make the relentless ringing stop. Most people would drain their savings to avoid being painted as a sociopath on the internet and exiled by their entire bloodline. My mother was counting on that exact human weakness. She assumed the intense shame and the public vitriol would break my spirit. She assumed I would revert back to the terrified little girl who always apologized to keep the peace. She wanted me to feel so thoroughly isolated and hated that paying her off would seem like the only viable path to survival. But she failed to understand that the fire she was using to burn me was the exact same fire I was using to fuel my investigation. I sat back against the leather seat of the taxi and let out a long, slow breath. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to call her and beg for a truce. I felt an absolute crystal-clear sense of purpose. The intense gaslighting and the vicious attacks only confirmed that I was staring directly at a massive unexploded bomb. Her desperate, escalating behavior proved that the missing $267,000 was tied to something incredibly dangerous. The more she screamed, the closer I knew I was getting to the truth. I arrived at my apartment building and paid the driver. I rode the elevator up to my floor with my phone still buzzing in my hand. I walked into my home office and booted up my secure high-speed desktop workstation. The family noise, the voicemails, the GoFundMe page, all of it was just a chaotic smokescreen designed to hide all the real data. I was going to ignore the loud flying monkeys. I was going to hold the boundary like a fortress wall. Every single nasty comment was just additional confirmation that my mother was in a state of absolute financial terror. I opened my encrypted financial software and prepared to dig deeply into my mother's digital footprint. I needed to access the banking portals. I needed to trace the exact path of the money. I needed to find proof linking the missing funds to my grandmother. The smear campaign was deafening, but the numbers were going to speak the absolute truth. The forensic deep dive was about to begin. I placed my hands firmly on the keyboard, ready to completely dismantle her pristine suburban lie. The bright light of my dual monitors illuminated my home office. The first step in any financial forensic investigation is establishing the exact origin point of the funds. I already knew my mother took out a $200,000 home equity line of credit. The county recorder of deeds had confirmed that much, but taking out a line of credit is merely opening a door. I needed to see exactly who walked through it. I logged into a specialized public records database that aggregates financial filings, court records, and property data across multiple states. It is a highly sensitive tool we use at my corporate firm to run deep background checks on potential merger targets. Today I was using it to audit my own mother. I typed in her social security number, which I had memorized years ago when I filled out my own financial aid forms, because she absolutely refused to help me. The database took a moment to compile her massive digital footprint. When the results populated on my screen, I filtered them to isolate large banking transactions and property liens. I was looking for the precise disbursement path of that $200,000. Most people who take out a massive line of credit against their home use it to remodel a kitchen or pay off crushing medical debt. There are always concrete paper trails for legitimate expenses. Contractors file permits. Hospitals report settled debts. But my mother's search results showed absolutely zero home improvement permits. There were no satisfied medical liens. There were no large payments to legitimate verified creditors. The money had simply vanished from her primary accounts. But money never truly vanishes. It just changes hands. I broadened my search parameters to look at uniform commercial code filings and corporate affiliations connected to her primary residential address. If she did not spend the money on her house, she transferred it somewhere else, and transfers of that size leave massive digital wakes. A new document popped up on my screen, causing my eyes to narrow. It was a state business filing from exactly 18 months ago. My mother had not spent the $200,000. She had wired it in a single massive lump sum. I clicked on the wire transfer record and stared at the beneficiary account. The receiving entity was not a local contractor or a hospital billing department. It was a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. The company was officially named Apex Visionary Holdings, LLC. The name sounded exactly like the kind of pretentious, meaningless corporate jargon my older brother would invent. I opened a new tab and accessed the Delaware Division of Corporations Registry. Delaware is famous for allowing corporate anonymity, but as a forensic accountant, I know all the back doors. I pulled the franchise tax records and the initial formation documents for the LLC. The sole managing member was listed clearly on the second page. Cameron Anderson, my brother, the golden child, the brilliant startup entrepreneur. I felt a cold, sharp smile touch my lips. He had not secured institutional seed funding. He had not impressed a room full of venture capitalists with his revolutionary business acumen. He had simply cried to his mommy and convinced her to mortgage her perfectly paid-off colonial house to fund his delusions of grandeur. My mother had wired him $200,000 of her hard-earned home equity. But I needed to know exactly what he did with that massive influx of cash. I needed to know why the money was entirely gone and why the bank was now threatening to forcefully foreclose on her home. I cross-referenced the LLC's tax identification number with public expenditure databases. What I found was a spectacular masterclass in pure financial negligence. Cameron had not built a tech company. He had built a personal slush fund. Apex Visionary Holdings had 0 registered employees. It had 0 filed patents. It had 0 reported revenue streams. It was nothing but a hollow shell company designed to process my mother's home equity. I started pulling the expense reports associated with the corporate accounts. The sheer audacity of his spending was breathtaking. Within the first week of receiving the $200,000 wire transfer, Cameron had executed a massive down payment on a luxury vehicle. I pulled the vehicle registration records. It was a matte black Porsche Panamera. He had registered it under the company name to falsely claim it as a business expense. He had literally used our mother's house to buy himself a sports car so he could look successful driving around downtown Chicago. The corporate ledger was a horrifying roadmap of unearned luxury. There were massive charges for international travel. He had booked first-class flights to Tulum and Mykonos. He had stayed at 5-star resorts claiming they were networking retreats for his non-existent startup. There were astronomical bills for high-end steakhouses and VIP bottle service at exclusive nightclubs. He was playing the role of a wealthy tech founder while rapidly draining the very roof over his mother's head. But the luxury cars and exotic vacations only accounted for about $80,000. I kept digging through the transactional data to find the rest. I traced a series of rapid-fire wire transfers from the LLC to an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. Cameron had taken the remaining $120,000 of his mother's home equity and dumped it directly into highly volatile alternative digital currencies. I pulled up the historical charts for the specific tokens he had purchased. My professional eye quickly calculated the devastating loss. He had bought in at the absolute peak of a hyped-up market cycle. Within 6 months, the market had completely crashed. His digital assets had lost 95% of their value. The $120,000 had evaporated into thin air. He had quite literally gambled away his mother's house on a speculative digital trend. I sat back in my chair and let the profound reality of the scam wash over me. Cameron was not a victim of a tough business climate. He was a complete fraud. He had shamelessly exploited our mother's desperate need to have a successful golden child. He had sold her a fake dream, and she had been so blinded by her fierce favoritism that she handed him the keys to her financial stability. And when the money ran out and the bank came knocking, they did not blame each other. They did not take responsibility for their catastrophic choices. They turned around and blamed me. They had the absolute nerve to ambush me in my corporate lobby and demand that I pay for the Porsche and the failed crypto investments. They were trying to shame me on the internet, calling me a heartless sociopath, while they frantically tried to cover up a financial disaster entirely of their own making. I felt a surge of intense righteous energy. The heavy guilt they had tried to force on me was completely neutralized. I had the absolute proof of their negligence. I had the digital paper trail that exposed Cameron as a complete fraud and Linda as his willing financier. I took my yellow legal pad and wrote down the exact timeline. 18 months ago, Linda takes out a $200,000 home equity line of credit. 2 days later, Linda wires $200,000 to Apex Visionary Holdings, LLC. Within 6 months, Cameron squanders the entire amount on luxury items and failed cryptocurrency gambles. Today, the bank issues a formal notice of default for $200,000. The timeline was perfectly airtight. The narrative was absolutely undeniable. I had successfully unraveled the first massive layer of their deception. But as I stared at the flawless timeline, the lingering mathematical problem reared its head again. I tapped my fountain pen against the pad. The numbers were still aggressively fighting each other. I had successfully traced the $200,000. I knew exactly where it came from and exactly how Cameron had destroyed it. I knew why my mother's house was facing imminent foreclosure, but the invoice she sent me to the entire extended family group chat was not for $200,000. She had explicitly demanded $467,000. She had set up a public fundraising campaign for exactly $467,000. If she only needed to stop the foreclosure on her house, she only needed $200,000. She would not risk the extra public exposure of demanding more than double what she owed the bank unless she was in a much deeper, much darker hole. I had found the bottom of the home equity well, but there was another massive financial crater hiding just out of sight. I stared at the bold numbers I had written on my pad. 467,000 minus 200,000 equals 267,000. There was a missing $267,000. Cameron had clearly blown a total of nearly $500,000. He had drained the house first. But when that money vanished into the crypto crash, he must have gone back to the well. He must have begged our mother for more cash to save his failing scam. And Linda, desperate to protect the illusion of her successful son, had somehow found another $267,000 to give him. I had hit a temporary dead end. I had exhausted the public property records. I had traced the corporate accounts as far as the public filings would allow. I had undeniable proof of the first phase of the fraud, but I was staring blindly at a massive gap in the ledger. My mother did not have a high-paying job. She did not have a massive stock portfolio. She did not have a second property to mortgage. So where on earth did a woman with no other major assets find a spare $250,000 in liquid cash to hand to her fraudulent son? I sat in the quiet of my home office, listening to the soft hum of my computer tower. I closed my eyes and mentally mapped out every single branch of our family tree. I thought about every relative, every asset, every possible source of generational wealth. There was only one other pool of significant money in our entire bloodline, and the realization of what my mother might have done to access it made my blood run absolutely cold. The realization hit me with the chilling force of a winter storm rolling off Lake Michigan. I stood up from my desk and began to pace the length of my home office. My mind was rapidly sorting through decades of complex family financial history. My mother did not have a high-paying corporate job. She did not possess a secret diversified stock portfolio. She had no other physical properties to leverage for cash. Yet I was absolutely certain she had found an additional $267,000 to feed Cameron's fraudulent startup. There was only one other significant pool of liquid wealth in our entire extended family tree. It was the untouchable sacred cow of the Anderson family finances. It was Grandma Ruth's irrevocable medical trust. Grandma Ruth was my late father's mother. When my grandfather passed away 20 years ago, he established a massive legally binding trust designed specifically to cover Ruth's high-end assisted living and end-of-life medical care. He wanted to guarantee that she would never want for anything in her twilight years. The trust was strictly structured. The principal was locked away, generating interest to pay for her luxury care facility in the suburbs. My mother, Linda, had successfully petitioned the probate court to be named the sole managing trustee shortly after my father died. She argued that she was the most responsible and financially savvy family member to oversee the disbursements. The court granted her total control over the accounts. I stopped pacing and stared blindly at my office wall. For years, my mother had weaponized her position as trustee. She constantly complained to the extended family about the heavy burden of managing Ruth's complicated finances. She used it as ultimate proof of her absolute selfless devotion to the family. She held the power of the purse strings over Grandma Ruth, controlling every aspect of her medical care and living arrangements. If Linda needed $250,000 in untraceable, untaxed liquid cash, the medical trust was the only possible source. But irrevocable trusts are not personal piggy banks. They are heavily regulated by state law. Trustees have a strict fiduciary duty to the beneficiary. Stealing from an irrevocable trust, especially an elder care medical trust, is not just a moral failing, it is a severe federal crime. It is elder financial abuse and felony embezzlement. I sat back down at my desk and pulled my keyboard toward me. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer massive scale of the fraud I was uncovering. I needed to verify the oversight timeline. Irrevocable trusts with designated trustees are subject to mandatory state auditing. The probate court requires annual financial disclosures to ensure the trustee is not mismanaging the beneficiary's assets. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the County Probate Court Public Records portal. I typed in the specific trust identification number which I had kept on file from a brief period when I tried to help my mother organize her taxes before she disowned me. The court docket loaded on my screen. I scrolled past years of routine annual filings. The historical records showed a pristine, perfectly balanced ledger. Linda had always been meticulous about her annual reports, but I was not looking at the past. I was looking for the future deadlines. My eyes found the upcoming schedule section. The screen displayed a bold red warning icon. The mandatory annual comprehensive audit for the Ruth Anderson Medical Trust was scheduled for May 28th. I looked at the digital calendar in the bottom corner of my monitor. Today was May 14th. The state auditors were scheduled to review the complete financial ledger of the medical trust in exactly 14 days. The entire twisted puzzle clicked violently into place. The timeline was completely devastating in its perfect logic. 18 months ago, my mother drained her home equity to give Cameron $200,000. When Cameron lost that initial investment in the cryptocurrency crash, he begged her for more money to keep his fake startup illusion alive. Linda, desperate to protect her golden child, secretly dipped into Grandma Ruth's medical trust. She illegally wired an additional $267,000 to Cameron's offshore accounts, believing he would eventually generate a massive return on investment, and she could quietly replace the stolen funds before anyone noticed. But Cameron was a complete fraud. The money evaporated, the startup failed, and now the music had completely stopped. Linda was utterly trapped in a vice of her own making. The bank had issued a formal notice of default on her home equity loan. They were preparing to foreclose on her beloved colonial house, exposing her financial ruin to the entire neighborhood. But the foreclosure was actually the least of her problems. The true impending disaster was the probate court audit. In exactly 14 days, state financial auditors were going to open the ledger for Grandma Ruth's medical trust. They were going to look for the principal balance. They were going to discover that $267,000 was missing. They were going to demand to see the disbursement receipts. When Linda could not produce legitimate medical invoices to justify the missing funds, the auditors would immediately alert state prosecutors. The investigation would take less than a week. The paper trail would lead directly from the trust account to Cameron's offshore crypto wallets. Linda was not just facing the loss of her home. She was facing imminent federal prison time for grand theft and elder financial abuse. Cameron was facing prison time for receiving stolen funds and wire fraud. The golden child and the perfect matriarch were staring down the barrel of dual felony convictions. That was the true origin of the unhinged Mother's Day invoice. It was never about childhood braces or college tuition. It was a panicked, frantic extortion attempt designed to cover up a massive federal crime. Linda needed exactly $467,000 to balance both ledgers. She needed $200,000 to pay off the bank and stop the public foreclosure. She needed $267,000 to secretly replace the stolen medical funds before the state auditors arrived in 2 weeks. She targeted me because I was the only person in her orbit who actually had that kind of liquid capital. She knew I had built a highly successful corporate career. She knew I had no spouse and no children. In her twisted narcissistic mind, my hard-earned wealth was merely an emergency reserve fund for her own catastrophic mistakes. She believed she could use the entire extended family as a blunt instrument of social terror. She thought she could whip the aunts and uncles into such a frenzy of public shaming that I would break down, cry, and wire her the money just to buy back my peace and my reputation. She was literally trying to crowdsource her own legal defense fund through aggressive psychological warfare. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her plan was almost impressive. She was willing to completely destroy my emotional well-being. She was willing to orchestrate a massive public smear campaign calling me a sociopath and a terrible daughter, all to save her arrogant, fraudulent son from facing the consequences of his actions. She was perfectly fine with me paying for the Porsche and the luxury vacations while she continued to play the role of the devoted, selfless mother. I picked up my phone. The Anderson Family Network group chat was still muted, but I could see the notification badge displaying over 200 unread messages. The flying monkeys were still blindly attacking me. They were still fiercely defending the woman who was actively stealing from their own elderly mother. The aunts and uncles who were cursing my name had absolutely no idea that Linda was quietly draining the very fund designed to keep their matriarch comfortable and safe. I needed to secure the final piece of undeniable proof. I had the logical timeline and the mathematical certainty, but in forensic accounting, logic is not enough. You need the actual signed documents. You need the smoking gun that links the suspect directly to the missing funds. I needed to see the internal ledger for Grandma Ruth's trust account, but I was not the trustee. I had no legal authority to demand the bank records. The only person who could legally request the transaction history other than Linda was the beneficiary herself. I needed to visit Grandma Ruth. The thought made my chest tighten with a sudden sharp pain. I had not seen my grandmother in nearly 2 years. After my mother publicly disowned me, she had systematically cut off my access to the rest of the family. She had moved Ruth to a new, highly exclusive assisted living facility in the northern suburbs and aggressively restricted the visitor list. Linda controlled Ruth's phone and her schedule, ensuring I could never establish direct contact. I had sent cards and letters, but I strongly suspected my mother intercepted them before they ever reached Ruth's room. I had stayed away because I believed it was the only way to keep the peace. I believed my presence would only cause drama and upset my grandmother. I had accepted the exile to protect her from my mother's wrath. But now I realized my forced absence had left Ruth completely vulnerable to financial predation. My mother had isolated her not for her protection, but for her own financial convenience. I checked the time. It was early afternoon. The luxury care facility had open visiting hours until 8 in the evening. I did not know if Linda had formally banned me from the premises, but I was not going to let a front desk receptionist stop me. I was a senior forensic accountant, armed with the knowledge of a massive impending felony. I was going to walk into that facility and get exactly what I needed. I stood up and grabbed my tailored coat. I packed my laptop and my portable scanner into my leather briefcase. I was stepping onto the front lines of a major financial crime scene, and I needed to be fully prepared to extract the data quickly. I walked out of my apartment and hailed another cab. The drive to the northern suburbs would take an hour. It gave me exactly 60 minutes to formulate a strategy on how to gently explain to an 82-year-old woman that her devoted daughter was actively stealing her end-of-life care money to fund a fraudulent crypto scam. The family war had officially moved beyond mean text messages and petty insults. I was bringing the absolute crushing weight of federal law directly to their doorstep. The cab ride to the northern suburbs felt agonizingly slow. The sprawling concrete jungle of Chicago gradually gave way to manicured lawns and towering oak trees. I watched the scenery blur past the window, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I needed to see Grandma Ruth. I needed to see the internal ledger of the medical trust. I needed the undeniable smoking gun. But more than anything, I needed to make sure she was safe. The facility was an hour away, but the distance felt much greater. It felt like I was crossing a massive emotional border, returning to a family battlefield I thought I had left behind forever. The luxury care facility was designed to look like a high-end country club rather than a medical institution. The architecture featured sweeping stone pillars and massive glass windows. The grounds were flawlessly landscaped with vibrant spring flowers and bubbling fountains. This was exactly the kind of place my grandfather had envisioned when he established the irrevocable trust. He wanted Ruth to spend her final years surrounded by absolute comfort and dignity. I paid the cab driver and walked up the wide, circular driveway. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase tightly. The heavy glass doors slid open automatically. The lobby smelled faintly of lavender and expensive floor wax. I approached the polished mahogany reception desk, preparing myself for a potential confrontation. My mother had absolute control over Ruth's care. It was highly likely she had placed my name on a strict do not admit list. The receptionist was a young woman in a crisp uniform. She looked up with a polite, professional smile. "Can I help you?" "I am here to see Ruth Anderson," I said, keeping my voice low and authoritative. "I am her granddaughter, Julia." The receptionist tapped her keyboard, bringing up the resident registry. She frowned slightly as she read the screen. "I am sorry, Miss Anderson, but according to our records, the primary trustee has requested that all family visits be cleared through her first." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the high counter. I anticipated this exact response. My mother was thorough in her isolation tactics. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my corporate identification badge and a blank manila folder. I slid them across the polished wood. "I understand the standard protocol," I said, my tone perfectly level. "However, I am a senior forensic accountant, and I am here in a professional capacity regarding the impending state audit of Mrs. Anderson's medical trust. The annual review is scheduled for May 28th. If I am denied access to the beneficiary today, I will be forced to note the obstruction in my preliminary report to the probate court. I am sure the facility administration does not want to be cited for interfering with a financial investigation." It was a complete bluff. I had no official mandate from the probate court. I was conducting a rogue personal investigation. But I delivered the lie with such absolute corporate certainty that the receptionist immediately hesitated. Facility employees are trained to avoid any situation that involves legal liability or state auditors. She looked at my heavy corporate badge and the serious expression on my face. "Let me just call the floor nurse to see if Mrs. Anderson is awake," she said nervously, picking up the phone. A few minutes later, I was walking down the quiet carpeted hallway of the residential wing. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs. I had not seen my grandmother in 2 years. I did not know what to expect. I did not know how much my mother had poisoned her mind against me. I reached room 412 and knocked gently on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," a familiar voice called out. It was slightly thinner than I remembered, but still sharp and clear. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The room was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight. It was decorated with elegant furniture and dozens of framed family photographs. Grandma Ruth was sitting in a plush armchair near the window. She looked frail. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her frame was noticeably smaller. A colorful woven blanket was draped across her lap. She turned her head toward the door. When her eyes focused on my face, she gasped softly. "Julia." "Grandma," I said, stepping fully into the room. I was so afraid she would turn me away. I was afraid Linda had completely brainwashed her. But Ruth did not look angry or resentful. She looked profoundly relieved. "Oh, my sweet girl." She reached out her thin, trembling hands. "Come here. Let me look at you." I walked across the room and knelt beside her chair. I wrapped my arms around her delicate shoulders, hugging her tightly. She smelled of the same rosewater perfume she had worn since I was a little girl. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. The 2 years of forced separation felt like a massive stolen block of time. "I missed you so much, Grandma," I whispered against her soft cheek. "I am so sorry I stayed away." She patted my back gently. "I know why you stayed away, Julia. Linda makes it very difficult for anyone who disagrees with her. But you are here now, and you look so beautiful, so strong." I pulled back and looked at her face. Despite the warm reunion, I noticed a deep shadow of anxiety lingering in her bright blue eyes. Her hands were clutching the edge of her blanket with nervous tension. She looked like a woman who was carrying a heavy, terrifying secret. "Grandma, are you okay?" I asked, studying her pale features. "You look frightened. Is they treating you well here?" She glanced nervously toward the closed door as if expecting my mother to burst into the room at any second. "They treat me wonderfully here," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But I will not be here much longer. I am trying to pack my things, but I am so tired. I frowned in confusion. Pack your things. What do you mean? You are not going anywhere. This facility is fully paid for by Grandpa's trust. Ruth shook her head slowly. Tears welled up in her eyes. No, Julia. The money is gone. We are completely destitute. The words hit me like a physical blow. The absolute cruelty of my mother's manipulation was staggering. She was not just stealing from the trust. She was actively terrorizing an 82-year-old woman to cover her tracks. Who told you the money was gone? I asked, my voice dropping to a serious professional register. Did Linda tell you that? Ruth nodded, wiping a tear from her wrinkled cheek. She was here 2 days ago. She was crying so hard, Julia. She said she lost her house. She said the stock market crashed and the family is completely ruined. She told me the trust account is completely empty. She said I have to move to a state-run facility next week because she cannot afford to keep me here. My blood ran absolutely cold. Linda was aggressively gaslighting the matriarch. She was preparing to forcefully uproot an elderly woman from her comfortable home and dump her into a low-income state facility. She was doing this entirely to hide the missing $267,000 before the state auditors arrived. If Ruth was moved out of the luxury facility, the sudden drop in the trust balance could be falsely attributed to the massive costs of emergency relocation and medical debt. Linda was planning to use Ruth's terrifying eviction as a smokescreen to cover the embezzlement. Grandma listened to me very carefully. I took both of her trembling hands in mine. I looked directly into her frightened eyes. The family is not destitute. The stock market did not crash. You are not moving to a state facility. Ruth looked at me with deep confusion. But Linda showed me the papers. She showed me the bank notices. She said the money simply vanished. Linda is lying to you, Grandma, I said firmly. The money did not vanish. She stole it. She stole it to bail out Cameron, and now she is trying to scare you into moving so she can hide the theft from the state auditors. The shock on Ruth's face was profound. She stared at me, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Linda, my own daughter, she stole from the medical trust. I nodded slowly. I am a forensic accountant, Grandma. I track missing money for a living. I have already found the public records. Linda took out a massive loan against her house and gave the money to Cameron. He blew it all on luxury cars and failed investments. Now she needs exactly $467,000 to stop the bank from foreclosing on her home and to replace the money she stole from your trust. That is why she is trying to force you out. She needs a cover story for the missing funds. Ruth sat back in her plush chair. The fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by something much sharper. The frail, frightened elderly woman vanished. In her place was the fierce, intelligent matriarch who had helped my grandfather build his fortune. She lied to me, Ruth whispered. The anger in her voice was cold and hard. She sat in that very chair and cried crocodile tears while she planned to throw me onto the street. She used my fear against me to protect that useless, spoiled boy. Yes, Grandma. I confirmed. She did. But I am not going to let her get away with it. I am not going to let her move you. I am going to stop her, but I need your help to do it. Ruth straightened her posture. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. The trembling had completely stopped. What do you need me to do, Julia? I unlatched my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out my portable digital scanner. I set it on the small table next to her chair. I need to see the internal ledger for the medical trust. I need the actual bank statements that Linda forces you to sign. I need the undeniable proof of the exact date and time she wired the funds to Cameron. As the beneficiary of the trust, Ruth received monthly paper statements detailing the account balances and disbursements. Linda was legally required to provide these documents. I knew my mother probably tried to hide them or confusingly explain them away, but they had to be in this room somewhere. Ruth nodded decisively. She walked over to her wooden dresser and pulled open the bottom drawer. She reached under a stack of folded sweaters and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She tries to take them away after she makes me sign the acknowledgement forms, Ruth said, handing the heavy envelope to me. She says they are too complicated for me to understand. But I always make sure to keep the copies. Your grandfather taught me never to throw away a financial record. I took the envelope and opened the metal clasp. The entire fraudulent history of the past 18 months was sitting right in my hands. The smoking gun was finally loaded. I pulled the stack of bank statements out and began to quickly scan the columns of numbers. The final piece of the massive puzzle was about to snap violently into place. The golden child and the perfect matriarch were about to face the absolute devastating reality of their choices. I laid the thick stack of monthly bank statements out on the polished wooden table next to Grandma Ruth's chair. My fingers moved swiftly, spreading the papers out in chronological order. I was no longer a granddaughter sitting in a luxury care facility. I was a senior forensic accountant actively dismantling a federal crime. The air in the room felt heavy and charged. Ruth sat perfectly still, watching my face with intense focus. She did not interrupt. She let me work. I started with the statement from 18 months ago. This was the exact month Linda had executed the $200,000 home equity line of credit. I scanned the beginning balance of the irrevocable medical trust. It was healthy and robust. The principal was sitting safely exactly where my grandfather had intended it to be. I moved to the next statement. I was looking for the precise moment the panic set in. I was looking for the exact date Cameron realized his cryptocurrency investments had completely evaporated, and he demanded a massive financial bailout from our mother. I found it on the statement dated 14 months ago. My eyes locked onto a massive singular withdrawal. It was not a series of small suspicious charges. It was one massive catastrophic transfer, $267,000. I stared at the number printed in cold black ink. My heart thumped aggressively. The math was now absolutely flawless. $200,000 from the defaulted home equity loan, plus $267,000 from the embezzled medical trust, equaled exactly $467,000. That was the exact amount Linda had demanded on the absurd Mother's Day invoice. She was trying to extort $467,000 from me to cover the dual ledgers before the bank foreclosed on her house and the state auditors discovered the missing trust funds. She had weaponized the entire extended family to pressure me into saving Cameron from federal prison. But the bank statement only showed the withdrawal amount. In a court of law, that is not enough. A withdrawal is just a number. To prove embezzlement, you have to prove intent and destination. I needed to see exactly where that $267,000 went. I needed the wire transfer authorization form. Grandma, I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. Do you have the supplemental documents that came with this specific monthly statement? The bank usually includes copies of cleared checks and wire transfer authorizations. Ruth nodded sharply. She knows I always demand the full packet. She hates giving it to me, but she knows your grandfather trained me to read the fine print. She pointed a trembling finger toward the bottom of the manila envelope. Look in the back. There are some loose papers she tried to take away from me. I hid them when she went to the bathroom. I reached into the heavy envelope and pulled out a small stack of folded documents. I sifted through them quickly. My breath caught sharply in my throat. There it was, the absolute undeniable smoking gun. It was a formal wire transfer authorization request. It was filled out in my mother's distinct aggressive handwriting. The date matched the massive withdrawal from the medical trust. The amount listed was exactly $267,000. But it was the beneficiary information that sealed her fate completely. Linda had not wired the money to a legitimate medical provider. She had not wired it to a luxury care facility. She had explicitly authorized the bank to send $267,000 directly to an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. The receiving entity listed on the wire transfer was Apex Visionary Holdings, LLC, Cameron's fake startup. She had literally stolen $250,000 from an 82-year-old woman and wired it directly to a Cayman Islands account controlled by her fraudulent 35-year-old son. I looked closely at the signature line at the bottom of the authorization form. My blood ran completely cold. Linda had not just authorized the transfer as the managing trustee. She had actually forged Grandma Ruth's signature on the secondary approval line. She committed felony forgery to execute a felony embezzlement. The sheer blinding arrogance of the crime was almost difficult to process. Linda truly believed she was untouchable. She believed she was so much smarter than the bank, the auditors, and the legal system. She thought she could easily replace the money by extorting her successful daughter before anyone ever noticed. "I have it, Grandma," I whispered, staring at the forged signature. "I have the absolute proof. She stole the money and sent it to Cameron, and she forged your name to do it." Ruth let out a long, shaky breath. She closed her eyes and leaned back against her plush chair. Her face looked incredibly tired, but the fierce determination had not left her features. "What do we do now, Julia?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do we call the police? Do we confront her?" I shook my head slowly. "No, we do not confront her privately. If we confront Linda behind closed doors, she will instantly destroy all the original digital and physical records. She will claim the paperwork is a misunderstanding. She will try to manipulate you into changing your story. She will gaslight the entire family and paint me as a crazy, aggressive daughter who is trying to steal her power. We cannot give her any room to spin the narrative." I carefully folded the wire transfer authorization request and the matching bank statement. I placed them safely inside my leather briefcase. "I am taking these original documents with me," I explained, locking the briefcase. "I have high-resolution portable scanners in my office. I am going to create certified encrypted digital copies of every single page. I am going to build an impenetrable forensic dossier." "And then what?" Ruth asked, opening her bright blue eyes. "Then we set a trap," I said coldly. "Linda is currently rallying the entire extended family against me. She is using the group chat to build a massive army of flying monkeys. She thinks public humiliation is her greatest weapon. She thinks she can terrorize me into writing that check by making me the villain of the family." I stood up and walked over to her chair. I knelt down and took her hands again. "I am going to let her build that army. I am going to let her gather every single aunt, uncle, and cousin into one room. I am going to let her take the stage and perform her grand theatrical victim routine. I am going to let her back herself completely into a corner in front of a live audience. And when she is at the absolute peak of her arrogance, I am going to drop the bomb. I am going to expose the embezzlement, the forgery, and the fake startup in front of everyone she has ever lied to." Ruth squeezed my hands tightly. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "Your grandfather would be so incredibly proud of you, Julia. You have his brilliant mind and his absolute lack of fear." We spent the next 20 minutes coordinating our strategy. I told Ruth to pretend she knew nothing. I told her to act like the frightened, confused, elderly woman Linda expected her to be. If Linda visited again, Ruth was to simply nod and agree to whatever outrageous lies Linda told her about the missing money. I walked out of the luxury care facility and hailed a cab back to downtown Chicago. My mind was operating at maximum professional capacity. I was no longer an emotional daughter dealing with family drama. I was a specialized forensic weapon actively targeting a massive financial threat. When I returned to my apartment, I immediately fired up my secure servers. I carefully scanned the forged wire transfer authorization and the trust bank statements. I uploaded the documents to an encrypted cloud drive, creating multiple redundant backups. I cross-referenced the Cayman Islands routing numbers with the Delaware LLC filings I had pulled earlier. The digital paper trail was now absolutely flawless. Any federal prosecutor could look at this dossier and secure an immediate grand jury indictment within 48 hours. My phone began to vibrate violently on my desk. The Anderson Family Network group chat was exploding again. The notifications were rolling in like a continuous digital wave. I had kept the chat muted, but the sheer volume of incoming messages was lighting up my screen. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. I needed to see what Linda was planning next. I needed to know how she was escalating the timeline. The state auditors were arriving in exactly 14 days, and her panic was becoming erratic. Linda had posted a new message tagged with high-priority alert icons. "This family is currently facing a catastrophic crisis," she wrote in the group chat. My ungrateful daughter Julia has completely ignored my pleas for help. She is perfectly content to watch me lose my home and sleep on the streets. I have tried to handle this privately, but her aggressive silence leaves me no choice. I am calling an emergency family meeting this Friday evening at 7 o'clock. We will be gathering at the Oak Room Steakhouse. Attendance is absolutely mandatory. We will be holding a formal intervention. If Julia refuses to attend or refuses to honor her debts, I will be formally and publicly disowning her from this family forever. The responses from the extended family were immediate and vicious. Aunt Martha confirmed her attendance and promised to help hold me accountable. Uncle Thomas aggressively demanded that I show up and face the family like an adult. Cousin Rebecca posted a long, angry paragraph calling me a coward. All 26 relatives were actively rallying behind the corrupt matriarch. They were perfectly primed for a public execution. I stared at the invitation on my screen. The Oak Room Steakhouse was a high-end, pretentious restaurant located in the suburbs, right near Linda's house. It was the exact type of place she loved to hold court and show off her fake wealth. She was incredibly desperate now. Friday was exactly the deadline she had set in her original unhinged invoice. She needed that $467,000 before the weekend, so she could clear the offshore wire transfers and balance the medical trust ledger before the state auditors arrived the following week. She thought a massive public intervention at a crowded luxury restaurant would finally break my spirit. She assumed I would be so utterly terrified of a screaming public confrontation with 26 relatives that I would simply hand over a certified check to make the nightmares stop. I felt a sharp, cold smile form on my face. I did not type a response in the group chat. I did not defend myself against the furious barrage of incoming insults. I simply clicked the small icon at the bottom of the screen. I selected the calendar app and blocked out Friday evening at 7 o'clock. I was going to walk directly into the lion's den. I was going to let her gather the entire family into one room. I was going to let her command the stage and deliver her flawless performance. I was going to let the aunts and uncles scream their self-righteous demands. And then I was going to completely incinerate her entire world. The weapon was fully loaded. The target had actively chosen the battlefield. The formal disownment party was about to become the most devastating financial presentation of my entire professional career. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, humid heat that settled over the city of Chicago. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, examining my reflection. I did not dress like a daughter going to a family dinner. I dressed like a corporate executioner stepping into a boardroom. I chose a tailored navy blue suit with sharp shoulders and a crisp white silk blouse. I pulled my dark hair back into a severe, flawless chignon. I wore no jewelry except a simple silver watch. I wanted absolutely zero distractions. I needed them to see me not as the quiet little girl they used to bully, but as the senior forensic accountant who was about to dismantle their entire lives. I slipped my phone into my pocket. I did not bring a purse. I did not bring a briefcase. I did not need paper files tonight. The digital trap was already set, and my smartphone was the only detonator I required. I took an executive car service from the city out to the affluent northern suburbs. The drive took 45 minutes. I spent the entire ride in absolute silence, watching the highway lights streak past the tinted windows. My phone buzzed occasionally with automated calendar reminders, but the family group chat remained entirely silent. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that always precedes a massive, coordinated strike. They were waiting for me. They were gathering their forces and sharpening their knives. The Oak Room Steakhouse was exactly the kind of establishment my mother adored. It was painfully pretentious. The exterior featured heavy mahogany doors and brass fixtures. The interior was draped in dark velvet, smelling strongly of expensive cigars, roasted garlic, and aged bourbon. It was the kind of restaurant where the waitstaff wore white gloves and the menu did not list the prices. Linda had undoubtedly reserved the largest private dining room they had. She wanted an enclosed arena where she could control the audience and trap her prey. I approached the host's stand. My posture was perfectly straight. I asked for the Anderson private event. The host gave me a tight, polite smile and led me down a long, dimly lit hallway away from the main dining floor. The muffled sounds of clinking silverware and low jazz faded away. We reached a set of heavy double doors at the very end of the corridor. The host pushed them open and stepped aside to let me enter. I stepped over the threshold, and the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind me. The private dining room was massive. A long, rectangular mahogany table stretched across the center of the space, taking up almost the entire room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm yellow light over the pristine white tablecloth. Every single chair was filled. All 26 members of the Anderson family network were sitting around that table. The visual impact of seeing them all gathered together was intense. My mother had successfully mobilized the entire bloodline. Aunt Martha and Uncle Thomas sat near the head of the table, their faces twisted into identical expressions of deep disapproval. Cousin Rebecca sat next to them, gripping her wine glass tightly and glaring at me with open hostility. I saw aunts, uncles, and second cousins from out of state who had clearly flown in specifically for this grand theatrical event. Linda had spared no expense and spared no effort to ensure that the jury pool was completely packed. At the very head of the table sat my mother. She was wearing a tailored black dress that looked deliberately mournful. She had styled her hair perfectly, but left her makeup slightly muted to enhance the illusion that she was a suffering, exhausted victim. She looked like a grieving widow holding court. Sitting directly to her right was Cameron. The golden child was wearing a crisp designer button-down shirt. He looked incredibly smug, but there was a frantic, nervous energy vibrating just beneath his arrogant posture. He kept tapping his fingers aggressively against the table. He knew his fraudulent startup was a complete disaster, but he still believed that my mother had everything under control. He believed that the 26 relatives in this room were going to bully me into handing over a massive check saving him from his own catastrophic failures. There was exactly one empty chair remaining in the room. It was positioned at the very opposite end of the long table directly facing my mother. It was the hot seat. It was deliberately placed so that every single person in the room could turn and stare at me, while Linda delivered her righteous judgment. I did not hesitate. I did not lower my eyes. I walked the entire length of the room with slow, measured steps. The silence was absolute and completely suffocating. 26 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement. I could feel the sheer weight of their collective judgment pressing down on my shoulders. They expected me to look terrified. They expected me to shrink under their hostile gaze. They expected the awkward, quiet scapegoat to stumble into the room begging for forgiveness. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair and sat down gracefully. I crossed my legs and rested my hands lightly on the empty white plate in front of me. I looked directly down the length of the table and made solid, unbroken eye contact with my mother. "Good evening, Linda," I said. My voice was calm and resonated clearly across the silent room. "I am here. Let us begin." A loud collective gasp rippled through the extended family. Aunt Martha actually clutched her pearl necklace. Using my mother's first name instead of calling her mom was a deliberate, calculated sign of profound disrespect in our family hierarchy. It was a clear signal that I was no longer playing by her rules. I was establishing myself as an equal adult, not a subordinate child. My mother's eyes narrowed into dark, dangerous slits. Her carefully constructed victim persona slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the vicious predator hiding underneath. But she quickly recovered. She took a deep, shaky breath and looked around the table, making sure her audience was fully captivated. "Julia," my mother started. Her voice was trembling perfectly with manufactured sorrow. "I prayed you would have the basic decency to show up tonight. I prayed you would look your family in the eye after what you have put us through this week." I simply smiled a cold, flat smile. I did not interrupt her. I wanted her to speak. I wanted her to dig the hole as deep as humanly possible. "We are gathered here today because this family is facing a devastating crisis." Linda continued, standing up slowly from her chair to command the room. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned forward. A crisis that was entirely preventable. A crisis caused by a shocking lack of respect and basic human decency. I have given my entire life to raising my children. I sacrificed my youth, my career, and my financial stability to ensure that you and your brother had every possible advantage. Aunt Martha nodded vigorously, wiping a dramatic tear from her eye. Uncle Thomas muttered his agreement. The echo chamber was functioning flawlessly. And how am I repaid for decades of selfless devotion? Linda asked, her voice rising in theatrical pitch. I am repaid with cruel silence. I am repaid with financial abandonment. I asked my successful, wealthy daughter for help in my darkest hour. I asked her to honor the massive debt she owes to the woman who gave her life. And she responded by ignoring my pleas while I stand on the absolute brink of losing my home. Cameron crossed his arms and glared at me. You make me sick, Julia. He spat across the table. Mom is literally facing homelessness, and you walk in here wearing a custom suit looking like you do not care at all. You are a cold-blooded monster. The murmurs of agreement grew louder. Cousin Rebecca slammed her hand on the table. You should be ashamed of yourself, Julia. How can you sit there and smile? You are tearing this family apart. I let the insults wash over me like water off glass. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket and placed it face down on the white tablecloth, right next to my empty wine glass. The small black rectangle was the only item I had brought to this grand execution. I am perfectly fine with my choices, Cameron, I said, keeping my tone completely even, and I am perfectly fine with my wardrobe. What I am curious about is why we are all sitting in a highly expensive private dining room at a premium steakhouse if our mother is supposedly destitute and facing imminent eviction. Who exactly is paying for the overpriced steaks tonight? The logic of my question hit the room like a sudden splash of ice water. A few of the cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was a glaring inconsistency in Linda's poverty narrative. If she was truly broke and packing her belongings into cardboard boxes, she could not afford to host a private intervention for 26 people at the Oak Room. My mother flushed bright red. Do not try to deflect your guilt onto me, she snapped sharply. Your Uncle Thomas generously offered to host this dinner because he loves this family and wants to save it from your destructive selfishness. I glanced at Uncle Thomas. He puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of his role as the wealthy savior of the evening. It was pathetic how easily she manipulated them all. She was using his money to fund her own extortion operation. This is an intervention, Julia, Linda declared, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to give you one final chance to redeem yourself. You will write a check tonight for the exact amount you owe me. You will cover the $467,000 to save my home and compensate me for my lifelong sacrifices. If you refuse to write that check before we leave this room tonight, I am formally and permanently disowning you. You will be cut off from this bloodline forever. You will have no mother, no brother, and no family. The threat hung heavily in the air. The absolute finality of her words was designed to break me. 26 people stared at me, waiting for the inevitable surrender. They waited for the tears. They waited for the apologies. They waited for me to reach into my pocket for a checkbook. I picked up my phone and turned the screen over. The quiet confidence in my movements made the room grow completely silent. The trap was fully sprung, and every single person in the room was exactly where I needed them to be. My fingers rested lightly on the smooth glass of my phone screen. I did not unlock it yet. I simply let it sit there on the pristine white tablecloth, acting as a silent anchor in the middle of the escalating storm. My mother misinterpreted my quiet stillness. She thought I was hesitating. She assumed the overwhelming presence of 26 glaring relatives had finally broken my corporate armor. In her twisted mind, she believed I was preparing to open my banking application and surrender. Sensing absolute victory, Linda decided to deliver the final crushing blow. She needed to ensure my submission was complete and publicly humiliating. She stood up taller at the head of the table and brought a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. She let out a ragged, theatrical sob that echoed loudly against the velvet walls of the private dining room. Look at her sitting there with her phone, Linda cried out, turning her head to address the aunts and uncles directly. She is probably calculating her net worth right now. She is doing the cold math on my suffering. That is what she is. A cold, calculating monster who views her own family as nothing more than a negative line item on a spreadsheet. Aunt Martha reached across the table and placed a comforting hand over Linda's arm. My mother leaned into the touch, soaking up the unearned sympathy like a sponge. I sacrificed my entire youth for that girl, Linda wailed. The tears flowing down her cheeks were genuinely impressive. She had likely spent hours practicing this exact performance in her bathroom mirror. I worked my fingers to the bone to make sure she had clothes on her back and food in her stomach. I gave up my 20s. I gave up my dreams. I poured every ounce of love I had into raising her. And how does she repay me? She moves to a luxury high-rise in Chicago and watches me drown. She is perfectly fine watching the bank rip my home away from me. She wants to see me sleeping on the cold streets. The sheer level of projection was breathtaking. She was the one who had drained her home equity to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. She was the one who had stolen from an elderly woman. Yet she stood there in a designer black dress, eating premium steak paid for by my uncle, loudly claiming she was a helpless martyr. She has always been like this. Linda continued, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. Even as a child, she was completely devoid of empathy. She never appreciated anything we did for her. She just took and took and took. And now, when I am begging for my survival, she just sits there and smiles. She is broken inside. She is entirely devoid of a human soul. The emotional manipulation worked flawlessly on her captive audience. A collective murmur of absolute disgust swept through the dining room. Relatives who had not spoken to me in a decade shook their heads in profound disappointment. They looked at me as if I were a dangerous criminal. That was the exact moment Cameron decided to insert himself back into the spotlight. He could not let our mother have all the attention. The golden child needed to play the role of the ultimate protector. He needed to prove to everyone in the room that he was the strong, successful son defending the fragile matriarch. Cameron pushed his chair back violently. The wooden legs screeched loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He stood up and slammed both of his hands flat against the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses rattled dangerously. "This has gone on long enough, Julia," Cameron shouted, pointing an aggressive finger directly at my face. "You are not going to sit here and torture our mother for your own sick amusement. You are not going to hold your wealth over her head like a weapon." I looked up at him, maintaining my flat expression. I did not say a word. I let him talk. I needed him to dig his grave as deeply as Linda was digging hers. "I know exactly how much money you make," Cameron declared, projecting his voice so the cousins at the far end of the room could hear every single word. "I know about your massive investment portfolios. I know about your corporate bonuses and your bloated retirement accounts. You have millions of dollars hoarded away while the woman who gave you life is facing total financial ruin." He puffed out his chest, looking around the room to ensure everyone was properly admiring his brave stance. He was desperately trying to secure his position as the hero because he knew the absolute truth. He knew the money he was demanding was going to cover his own catastrophic financial crimes. "You are going to make this family whole tonight, Julia," Cameron demanded. His voice was thick with unearned authority. "You are not just paying the $467,000 you owe Mom. You are going to liquidate whatever investment portfolios you need to ensure she never has to worry about money ever again. You are going to set up an irrevocable trust for her care, and you are going to fund it immediately." The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. He was actually trying to force me to set up a trust fund for the woman who was currently facing federal prison for embezzling from an actual trust fund. "And if you refuse to do the right thing, I will make you pay through the legal system." Cameron threatened, stepping around his chair to move closer to me. "I have spoken to my startup attorneys. We are preparing to file a massive civil lawsuit against you for elder abuse. We will prove that you financially abandoned a dependent senior citizen. We will drag your name through the mud. We will contact your firm. We will contact your clients. We will not stop until you are completely ruined and Mom gets every single penny she deserves." He stood there breathing heavily, completely consumed by his own fabricated bravado. He actually believed his threats were intimidating. He believed the threat of a fake elder abuse lawsuit would terrify a senior forensic accountant. The room erupted. Cameron's speech acted as a massive catalyst for the entire extended family. The restrained hostility suddenly boiled over into open aggressive warfare. The intervention transformed into a chaotic verbal dogpile. Uncle Thomas stood up, raising his voice over the rising din. "Listen to your brother Julia. He is the only one making any sense right now. You are acting like a spoiled brat. You need to open your banking app on that phone right now and transfer the funds. We are not leaving this restaurant until we see the confirmation screen." Cousin Rebecca leaned across the table, her face flushed with anger. "You are a greedy witch," she spat. "I cannot believe we share the same blood. You sit in your ivory tower and look down on us like we are trash. Aunt Linda deserves that money. She earned it by putting up with your miserable attitude for 18 years. Aunt Martha chimed in, her voice shrill and piercing. "You are an absolute disgrace to your late father's memory. If he were alive today, he would be utterly sickened by your behavior. He would disown you himself. How dare you treat his widow this way? You are a monster." The noise level in the private dining room became deafening. 26 people were shouting at me simultaneously. The aunts were crying out about family loyalty and blood debts. The uncles were demanding immediate financial compliance. The cousins were hurling vicious insults, calling me a narcissist, a sociopath, and a failure as a human being. "Pay the money," someone shouted from the back of the room. "Write the check right now," another voice demanded. "You owe her your life." Aunt Martha screamed. The tension in the room was absolutely suffocating. The air felt thick and heavy with collective rage. They were foaming at the mouth, aggressively demanding that I surrender my hard-earned wealth to satisfy a fabricated debt. They were united in their absolute certainty that I was the villain. They were completely blinded by Linda's masterful manipulation and Cameron's aggressive posturing. I sat perfectly still in the center of the raging storm. I did not flinch when Uncle Thomas pounded his fist on the table. I did not look away when Cousin Rebecca pointed a shaking finger at my face. I did not react when my mother let out another dramatic wailing sob. I let the fury reach its absolute zenith. I let them exhaust their vocabularies of hate. I let them push their self-righteous demands to the breaking point. I needed every single person in that room to fully commit to Linda's fraudulent narrative. I needed them to put all of their chips on the table. The screaming continued for 5 full minutes. It was a relentless barrage of coordinated psychological abuse. It was the exact same dynamic I had endured for my entire childhood, but magnified to an industrial scale. Finally, the shouting began to taper off. They were running out of breath and running out of insults. They realized that their aggressive tactics were not producing the desired result. I was not crying, I was not begging, I was simply watching them. Uncle Thomas was breathing hard, his face a dark shade of purple. "Well, Julia," he demanded, his voice rough and aggressive. "What is it going to be? Are you going to be a decent human being and wire the money, or are we leaving you behind forever?" The room fell into a tense, heavy silence. Everyone stared at me, waiting for my response. My mother looked at me from the head of the table, her eyes burning with triumphant expectation. Cameron stood beside her, crossing his arms and smirking. They truly believed they had won. They believed the sheer weight of 26 angry relatives had finally crushed my spirit. I slowly uncrossed my legs. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over my smartphone. The smooth glass felt cool against my palm. The time for observing was officially over. The trap had closed. I took a slow, deep breath. I looked directly at my mother and then shifted my gaze to my arrogant brother. I was about to unleash a financial shockwave that would completely incinerate their entire lives. "I am not writing a check tonight," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor blade. "I am not wiring any funds. And I am certainly not funding an irrevocable trust for a woman who is currently facing federal prison time for felony embezzlement." The words hung in the air, freezing the blood in their veins. The grand execution was about to be abruptly, violently reversed. I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. The Anderson Family Network group chat was already open and waiting. I had a very specific image saved to my clipboard. It was time to show the entire family exactly what the golden child and the perfect matriarch had been hiding in the dark. It was time for the photo drop. My thumb rested lightly on the smooth glass of my smartphone screen. The Anderson Family Network group chat was open and ready. The room was absolutely silent, waiting for my ultimate surrender. My mother sat at the head of the table, radiating arrogant triumph. Cameron stood beside her, practically vibrating with unearned victory. They truly believed they had pushed me past my breaking point. They thought the sheer weight of 26 screaming relatives had shattered my corporate armor and reduced me to a terrified child. I did not break character. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to match their chaotic energy. I simply tapped the small blue arrow on my screen. The file uploaded instantly. A soft digital swoosh echoed lightly from my device. Less than a second later, a synchronized chorus of chimes rings, and aggressive vibrations erupted across the massive mahogany dining table. 26 smartphones received the exact same notification at the exact same time. The sudden wave of electronic noise sliced through the heavy, suffocating tension in the room. People instinctively reached into their pockets and designer purses. The coordinated verbal assault against me paused completely as human curiosity took over. Uncle Thomas was the first to unlock his screen. Aunt Martha frantically dug through her clutch to find her reading glasses. Cousin Rebecca stopped glaring at me and looked down at her device. I sat perfectly still and watched the digital bomb detonate. I had not sent a long, angry paragraph defending my character. I had not sent an emotional plea for understanding. I had uploaded a single high-resolution photograph. It was a masterfully constructed forensic collage that laid their absolute ruin bare for everyone to see. The top half of the image was a crystal-clear scan of the official bank notice of default. It clearly showed Linda's home equity line of credit. The legal warning of imminent foreclosure was impossible to miss. The principal balance owed to the bank was circled in bright red ink, exactly $200,000. The bottom half of the image was the true lethal weapon. It was a certified high-definition copy of the wire transfer authorization form. It clearly displayed the movement of $267,000 directly out of the Ruth Anderson Irrevocable Medical Trust. The receiving beneficiary was boldly listed as Apex Visionary Holdings, Cameron's offshore fraudulent account. And resting right on the bottom line was the undeniable forged signature of Grandma Ruth. In the dead center of the collage, I had typed out the simple, indisputable mathematics of their crime. 200,000 plus 267,000 equals 467,000, the exact dollar amount printed on the fake Mother's Day invoice. I had highlighted that final grand total in a blinding neon yellow. The transformation in the private dining room was instantaneous and spectacular. I watched Uncle Thomas stare at his screen. The aggressive red flush of anger on his face rapidly drained away, leaving behind a sickly pale white. He zoomed in on the wire transfer document. As a secondary beneficiary of his mother's medical trust, he recognized the distinct account numbers immediately. He recognized the forged signature of the woman who raised him. He slowly lowered his phone and stared blankly at the far wall, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of what he was reading. Aunt Martha put her glasses on and squinted at the bright screen. Her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. The woman who had just spent 5 minutes screaming at me about family loyalty was now staring at hard documentary proof that her beloved sister was actively stealing from their elderly mother. Her hands began to shake violently. One by one, the hostile glares directed at me dissolved into absolute horrified comprehension. The cousins who had called me a greedy monster were now reading the legal foreclosure notice on Linda's pristine suburban home. The entire narrative of the wealthy, arrogant daughter abandoning the helpless, devoted mother shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Linda did not have her phone resting on the table. She looked around the long dining room in sudden, frantic confusion. She saw the profound horror washing over her siblings' faces. She saw the brutal shift in the atmosphere. The echo chamber she had so carefully constructed was collapsing in real time. "What is it?" Linda demanded, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "What did she send you? Do not look at it. It is probably just more of her corporate lies." Cameron reached a trembling hand into his expensive blazer pocket. He pulled out his oversized smartphone and swiped the screen. I kept my eyes locked directly on him. I watched the arrogant smirk literally melt off his face. His jaw went completely slack. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at the neon yellow number on the screen. He saw the name of his fake offshore company linked directly to his grandmother's stolen medical funds. The realization that their massive federal crime was fully exposed to the entire bloodline struck him like a physical blow. He slowly turned his head and looked at our mother with absolute dread. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back slowly. The loud scraping sound cut sharply through the stunned silence of the room. I stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my tailored navy blue suit with calm, deliberate motions. The entire extended family turned their eyes toward me. They were no longer looking at a scapegoat. They were looking at the executioner. I did not yell. I did not scream to be heard. I kept my voice at a smooth, professional conversational volume. The room was so incredibly quiet that every single syllable resonated with lethal clarity. "You did not bill me for raising me, Mom," I said. Linda physically recoiled as if the words had burned her. "You billed me to cover the federal crime you committed to fund Cameron's fake lifestyle." I continued, my voice slicing effortlessly through the dense air. "You stole Grandma's end-of-life care money." Linda opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled wheezing sound came out. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white. "Let us break down the exact math for everyone in the room," I announced, walking slowly away from my chair. I paced deliberately along the edge of the long table, ensuring every single relative heard the unvarnished truth. 18 months ago, Linda mortgaged her paid-off home to give Cameron $200,000 for his startup company. Cameron took that money and blew it on luxury cars, international vacations, and failed cryptocurrency investments. He lost every single penny. I paused and looked directly at Uncle Thomas. He was staring at my mother with a look of pure lethal betrayal. When the bank came calling, Linda realized she was going to lose her house. I continued maintaining my steady, measured pace. But Cameron needed more money to keep his fake business alive. So Linda went to the only other source of wealth available. She went to the irrevocable medical trust designed to keep your mother in her luxury assisted living facility. Linda forged Grandma's signature and illegally wired $267,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, controlled entirely by Cameron. "That is a lie!" Linda shrieked. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. "She is fabricating those documents. She is trying to destroy this family." No one jumped to defend her. No one offered a comforting hand. The aunts and uncles were staring at the highly detailed bank records on their glowing screens. The routing numbers, the official bank letterheads, the exact dates, the evidence was entirely bulletproof. "The state auditors are scheduled to review Grandma's medical trust on May 28th. I stated, bringing the devastating timeline into the light. "That is exactly 14 days from now. When the auditors open the ledger, they will immediately notice the missing $250,000. Linda and Cameron are facing imminent federal indictments for felony embezzlement and elder financial abuse." I stopped pacing and turned to face the entire room. "That is why you all received that ridiculous Mother's Day invoice," I said, sweeping my gaze across the stunned faces of my cousins. Linda needed exactly $467,000 to stop the bank foreclosure and replace the stolen medical funds before the state auditors arrived. She thought she could use all of you as a weapon. She manipulated you into organizing this grand intervention because she desperately needed to extort my hard-earned money to keep herself and her golden child out of federal prison. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the private dining room. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hung over the mahogany table. The relatives who had spent the last 20 minutes screaming at me were now forced to confront the horrifying reality that they had been used as attack dogs by a desperate criminal. They had viciously bullied the only innocent person in the room. I looked directly at my brother. Cameron was sweating profusely. He was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. The fake visionary entrepreneur was reduced to a terrified dependent staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. "I do not owe you a single dime, Linda," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. "I did not abandon this family. You destroyed it all on your own. You gambled your home and you stole from your own mother to protect a complete fraud." I reached down and picked up my smartphone from the table. I slipped it smoothly into the pocket of my blazer. I had delivered the truth. The forensic audit was complete. The illusion was permanently shattered. I turned my back on my mother and began walking toward the heavy double doors. The trap had closed exactly as designed, and I was walking away completely free. I reached for the heavy brass handles of the double doors. Before I could push them open, the absolute silence behind me violently shattered. It did not break with the sound of my mother's tears or my brother's arrogant threats. It broke with the booming, furious voice of Uncle Thomas. "These are the exact routing numbers." Uncle Thomas roared. The sound of his heavy fists slamming against the mahogany table made the crystal water glasses violently clatter. "Do not even try to deny it, Linda. I am a secondary beneficiary on that exact medical trust. I receive the sanitized annual summary reports. I know that 9-digit routing number by heart. It matches perfectly." I paused with my hand resting on the cool brass door handle. I did not turn around to face them. I simply stood there and let the chaotic symphony of their destruction wash over me. I wanted to hear the exact moment the entire family hierarchy completely inverted itself. "It is a forgery!" my mother shrieked. Her voice was shrill and cracking with raw animal panic. "Julia is a professional accountant. She knows how to manipulate digital files. She probably used Photoshop to change the numbers. She is trying to frame me because she is jealous of Cameron." "Do not insult my intelligence," Uncle Thomas yelled back. The sound of a chair scraping aggressively against the floor echoed through the large room. "I am looking at a certified bank wire transfer document. This has the official corporate watermark of the Cayman Islands financial institution. You cannot Photoshop a highly regulated offshore routing sequence. You stole from our mother, Linda. You stole from an 82-year-old woman who trusted you." "She is lying," Linda wailed desperately. "Cameron, tell them. Tell them your sister is a liar." But the golden child was completely abandoning ship. The sheer pressure of 24 furious relatives turning their collective rage toward him shattered his fragile ego. Cameron was not a brilliant visionary. He was a deeply cowardly dependent. When faced with the absolute certainty of federal prison time, he instantly turned on the only person who had ever supported him. "I did not know where the money came from," Cameron shouted. His voice was high-pitched and trembling with pure terror. "Mom just wired it to my business account. I swear to God I thought it was an early inheritance payout. I did not know she was stealing from Grandma Ruth. She told me the house was generating passive income." "You spineless little rat!" Cousin Rebecca screamed across the table. "You bought a matte black Porsche while Grandma was sitting in her care facility. You posted photos from 5-star resorts in Tulum while Aunt Linda was begging us to pay her overdue property taxes. You are both completely disgusting." Aunt Martha stood up, her voice cut through the shouting with an icy, lethal precision. "2 weeks ago you sat in my living room, Linda. You drank my wine and you cried on my shoulder. You told me you were going to be sleeping in your car because your cruel corporate daughter refused to help you, and the entire time you were actively covering up a $250,000 federal embezzlement. You weaponized our love for you. You manipulated us into attacking Julia." "Martha, please listen to me," Linda begged. The sound of her desperate pleading was pathetic. "I was just trying to protect my son. I was trying to save our family." "You do not have a family anymore," Aunt Martha stated coldly. "You are a thief. You are an abuser. And you are going to federal prison." I pushed the heavy brass handles downward. The thick wooden doors swung open, revealing the quiet, dimly lit hallway of the restaurant. I stepped out of the private dining room and let the doors click firmly shut behind me. The heavy wood instantly muffled the sound of 24 people violently tearing my mother and brother apart. The screaming faded into a dull, distant hum. I walked down the long, carpeted corridor. The air smelled of expensive roasted garlic and aged bourbon, but my lungs finally felt completely clear. The suffocating weight I had carried on my chest for my entire 33 years of existence was entirely gone. I passed the host stand. The host gave me a polite nod, having absolutely no idea that a massive financial crime syndicate had just been dismantled in the back room of his establishment. I stepped out of the mahogany front doors and into the humid Chicago night air. The city felt electric. The bright streetlights reflected off the damp pavement. My executive car service was waiting exactly where I had requested. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat and let the cool air conditioning wash over my face. "Back to the city center, miss," the driver asked, looking at me through the rearview mirror. "Yes, please," I replied smoothly. "Take the scenic route. There is absolutely no rush tonight." The heavy luxury vehicle pulled seamlessly away from the curb. I settled deep into the soft leather seat. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and retrieved my smartphone. The physical device felt warm against my palm. I unlocked the screen. The brightness illuminated the dark back seat of the car. I opened the Anderson Family Network group chat. The digital exodus was already beginning. The group chat interface, which had been a relentless source of toxic anxiety and coordinated bullying for the past 5 years, was rapidly transforming into a digital graveyard. Uncle Thomas was the very first to strike. He did not leave quietly. He posted a final scorching message directly into the main feed. "I am contacting my personal attorneys first thing tomorrow morning, Linda. You are no longer welcome in my home. You are no longer welcome at any family gathering. Do not ever attempt to contact me or my children again. You are entirely dead to us." The notification appeared instantly below his message. "Thomas Anderson has left the group." Aunt Martha followed less than 10 seconds later. "May God forgive you for what you did to our mother, because I absolutely never will. You are a vile, manipulative thief. I am deeply ashamed to share your last name. Martha Anderson has left the group." The dam completely broke. The relatives who had spent the entire week hurling vicious insults at my voicemail inbox were now desperately scrambling to sever all ties with the sinking ship. The notifications began rolling down my screen in a rapid, continuous cascade. It was a rhythmic, satisfying digital waterfall. Cousin Rebecca has left the group. Uncle Richard has left the group. Aunt Carol has left the group. Cousin David has left the group. They did not just exit the chat. They systematically dismantled Linda's entire social support network. I watched the read receipts and the active status indicators turn gray. Every single time a relative exited the group chat, they immediately blocked Linda's phone number. They blocked Cameron's phone number. They severed connections on every single social media platform. The massive army of flying monkeys that my mother had so carefully cultivated and weaponized against me was turning around and marching directly out of her life forever. The messages preceding the exits were short, brutal, and entirely finalizing. "You are a disgrace to this family. Do not ever call my house again. Enjoy federal prison, Cameron. I hope you lose the house, Linda." The notification chimes rang out in the quiet luxury car like a steady, triumphant heartbeat. I sat there in the dark, watching the numbers dwindle. The Anderson Family Network had started the evening with 26 active participants. Within 15 minutes of my departure from the Oak Room Steakhouse, the participant count plummeted aggressively. It dropped to 20, then it dropped to 15, then 10, then 5. The sheer speed of the abandonment was breathtaking. My mother had built her entire identity on being the beloved, respected matriarch of the Anderson family. She thrived on the attention and the perceived power she held over the extended bloodline. She believed her social capital was completely untouchable. I had just watched that entire social capital burn to the ground in less than 20 minutes. She was being entirely erased from the family tree by the very people she had invited to my execution. The participant count finally settled. I stared at the screen. The active member list showed exactly 3 people remaining in the chat. There was Linda, there was Cameron, and there was me. I waited for a moment, expecting one of them to type a desperate excuse or hurl a final pathetic insult, but the typing indicator never appeared. They were completely paralyzed. They were sitting alone in a private dining room surrounded by empty chairs and half-eaten expensive steaks, fully realizing that their lives were completely over. They had absolutely nobody left to manipulate. Their audience was gone. Their victims had fled. I tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of the chat application. I scrolled down to the bottom of the menu. I hovered my thumb over the bright red button that read Leave Group. I did not leave a parting message. I did not need a final dramatic word. The neon yellow numbers on my forensic collage had already spoken volumes. I pressed the red button and confirmed my exit. I then navigated to my contact list. I pulled up my mother's profile. I clicked Block Caller. I pulled up my brother's profile. I clicked Block Caller. I systematically went through every single communication application on my phone and permanently severed their digital access to my life. I locked the doors and threw away the keys. I locked my phone screen and placed the device on the leather seat next to me. I looked out the window at the glittering Chicago skyline approaching in the distance. The towering skyscrapers looked beautiful against the dark night sky. My city, my home, my sanctuary. The group chat was completely dead. 25 relatives had successfully executed a mass exodus. They had rightfully abandoned the toxic matriarch and the fraudulent golden child to face their impending legal doom alone. But as I watched the city lights reflect off the dark river, I realized there was one minor detail I had overlooked. The Anderson family network originally had 26 members, including Linda and Cameron. I had just watched 23 relatives exit the chat. I had exited the chat. That accounted for 24 people. There was exactly one extended family member who had not posted an angry message. There was exactly one relative who had not exited the group chat. There was exactly one person who did not immediately block Linda and Cameron across all platforms. The 26th person in that digital circle was Grandma Ruth. She had remained entirely silent during the entire digital implosion. But I smiled, knowing exactly why her account remained active in the dead group chat. You do not block the phone numbers of the people you are actively preparing to sue into absolute oblivion. Grandma Ruth was not typing angry messages because she was already executing a maneuver that was far more lethal than a simple social media block. The true retaliation was just beginning. The morning sun crested over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant golden light across my bedroom. I woke up feeling a profound sense of weightlessness. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had plagued my entire adult life was completely gone. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood by my floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below me. I had slept perfectly. There were no frantic text messages to read. There were no manipulative guilt trips to navigate. The digital fortress I had built around my peace of mind was absolutely impenetrable. But while I was enjoying my quiet morning, the ultimate consequences of my mother's actions were already being executed with lethal precision across the suburbs. I knew exactly why Grandma Ruth was the 26th person in the chat who did not immediately block Linda. Blocking someone is a defensive maneuver. It is a shield used to protect yourself from incoming toxicity. Grandma Ruth did not need a shield because she was actively dropping a nuclear bomb. You do not block the phone numbers of the people you are currently dragging into federal court. You keep the lines of communication wide open so your attorneys can serve them with official legal notices. Ruth had been fully briefed by me 2 days prior. She had not spent Friday evening crying over the betrayal. She had spent it sitting in her luxury suite alongside her late husband's ruthless estate lawyers, preparing a massive legal strike. At exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, the legal avalanche hit Linda and Cameron with devastating force. Ruth's primary attorney, a shark of a litigator named Harrison, did not send a polite warning letter. He filed an emergency injunction in the county probate court, completely revoking Linda's status as the managing trustee of the Irrevocable Medical Trust. The court granted the injunction immediately based on the certified wire transfer evidence I had provided. Linda was officially stripped of her power over the family wealth. But losing her prestigious title was merely the opening salvo in a highly coordinated legal assault. Harrison did not stop at the local probate court. He marched the forged wire transfer documents and the detailed financial ledgers directly to the federal authorities. He formally filed comprehensive charges of felony embezzlement and elder financial abuse against both Linda and Cameron. Because the stolen funds crossed international borders into offshore Cayman Islands, accounts the crime triggered immediate federal jurisdiction. The FBI and the state prosecutors were handed a perfectly gift-wrapped indictment. Cameron thought he was a brilliant visionary who could outsmart the system. He learned very quickly that the Internal Revenue Service does not play games with offshore wire fraud. By noon on Monday, the federal authorities had completely frozen every single one of Cameron's corporate and personal bank accounts. The remaining fraction of his cryptocurrency portfolio was locked down. His matte black Porsche Panamera was seized by federal agents as an asset purchased with stolen funds. The arrogant startup founder was left standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing to his name. He could not even afford to hire a defense attorney. The golden child was entirely stripped of his unearned armor. Linda suffered an even more spectacular collapse. She had desperately tried to keep her pristine suburban image intact by terrorizing her family. Now that image was being publicly incinerated. Because Ruth had originally co-signed the mortgage on Linda's colonial house decades ago to help her get established, Ruth's lawyers possessed the legal leverage to execute an immediate lien on the property. They filed a massive civil suit to recover the stolen $267,000, attaching the lawsuit directly to the deed of the house. The bank that held the defaulted home equity line of credit saw the federal indictments and the civil liens piling up. They completely abandoned any willingness to negotiate a payment plan. They accelerated the foreclosure process to the maximum legal speed. Linda was facing imminent and highly public eviction from the very home she used to judge everyone else. She was going to be physically removed from her pristine neighborhood by county sheriffs. But the loss of her beloved house was entirely overshadowed by the terrifying reality of her impending criminal trial. Elder financial abuse combined with felony forgery carried a mandatory minimum sentence. There was no clever manipulation that could save her. There was no fake crying that could sway a federal judge who was looking at a forged signature on a bank wire transfer. She was going to federal prison. Her perfectly crafted life was completely over. On Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a quarterly tax strategy for a new corporate client. My desk phone remained quiet, but my personal cell phone lit up with an incoming call. The caller identification showed an unknown number. I knew I had blocked my mother on every possible platform, but she was resourceful when she was desperate. She had clearly purchased a prepaid burner phone or borrowed a device from a stranger. I let the call go to voicemail. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or anxiety. I simply set the phone down and continued reading my client files. A few minutes later, the voicemail notification icon appeared on my screen. I tapped the icon and brought the phone to my ear to listen. I wanted to hear the final dying breath of her control. The audio began with a sharp, ragged intake of breath. Then the theatrical sobbing started. But this time the tears were not manufactured for an audience. They were fueled by genuine absolute terror. "Julia, please!" My mother's voice crackled through the speaker. Her tone was pathetic and completely broken. "You have to answer the phone. You have to talk to me." The federal agents were here this morning. They took my computer. They took my files. The bank sent an eviction notice. Cameron is sleeping on my couch because they seized his apartment and his car. We have absolutely nothing left. She paused to let out a loud, choking sob. She was waiting for me to jump in and save her. She was waiting for the conditioned response of the compliant daughter. When only silence greeted her, she continued her frantic pleading. "You have to pay for my defense attorney, Julia. I am your mother. You cannot let me go to prison. You have millions of dollars. You can fix this. You can make Grandma drop the charges. Tell her it was a misunderstanding. Please, Julia, I am begging you. I will do anything you want. I will apologize. I will be better. Just write the check and save me. I listened to the entire 3-minute voicemail with profound emotional detachment. She was not sorry for stealing from an 82-year-old woman. She was not sorry for weaponizing 26 relatives against me. She was not sorry for calling me a cold, calculating monster. She was only sorry that she got caught. She was only apologizing because she needed my money to keep herself out of a federal penitentiary. I lowered the phone from my ear. I did not experience a single twinge of guilt. I did not feel the urge to call her back and negotiate a truce. I pressed the delete button and watched the audio file vanish from my inbox. I then navigated to the block settings and permanently banned that new number from ever reaching my device again. I placed my phone back on the desk and returned to my corporate client files. My mother was no longer my problem. She was simply a closed case. That weekend I took the cab out to the northern suburbs. I did not go anywhere near my mother's neighborhood. I went straight to the luxury care facility. The sprawling grounds looked incredibly peaceful in the warm spring sunshine. I walked through the glass doors and approached the polished mahogany reception desk. The same young receptionist looked up at me with a polite smile. Before she could ask for my name, I spoke. I am Julia Anderson. I am here to see my grandmother Ruth. The receptionist typed my name into her computer. Her smile widened into genuine warmth. Yes, Miss Anderson. You are on the permanently approved VIP visitor list. You can go right up to room 412. I thanked her and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway. The air smelled of lavender and fresh linen. I knocked gently on the heavy wooden door. Come in, Ruth called out brightly. I stepped into the sunlit room. Grandma Ruth was sitting in her plush armchair by the window. She did not look frail or frightened today. She looked vibrant and completely at peace. She was wearing a beautiful floral blouse, and her silver hair was perfectly styled. A silver tea service was set up on the small table next to her, featuring 2 delicate porcelain cups and a plate of fresh pastries. Julia. She smiled, reaching her hands out to me. I was hoping you would come today. I walked over and hugged her tightly. The embrace felt incredibly grounding. I sat down in the chair opposite her and accepted the cup of hot tea she poured for me. The porcelain was warm against my hands. How are you feeling, Grandma? I asked, taking a sip of the fragrant tea. I feel absolutely wonderful, Ruth said, her blue eyes sparkling with sharp intelligence. Mr. Harrison called me this morning. The courts have officially frozen all of Linda's accounts. The embezzlement charges are moving forward swiftly. The trust is completely secure, and the facility administrators have assured me that I will never have to leave this room. She took a delicate sip of her tea and looked out the large window at the blooming gardens below. Your grandfather always said that the truth eventually balances the ledger. He was right. And he would be so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. You protected me, Julia. You protected this entire family from a terrible poison. I smiled and leaned back in my chair. We protected each other, Grandma, I said softly. We spent the next 2 hours talking about everything except Linda and Cameron. We talked about my design clients in the city. We talked about her favorite books. We talked about my grandfather's love for vintage architecture. We simply enjoyed each other's company without the heavy looming shadow of my mother's manipulation. For my entire life, I had been trapped in a toxic family hierarchy that demanded my absolute submission. I had been designated as the permanent scapegoat, forced to carry the emotional and financial burdens of a narcissistic mother and a fraudulent golden child. But I had finally broken the cycle. I had used my own skills and my own courage to systematically dismantle their entire empire of lies. I looked across the table at my grandmother. The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the peaceful room. I had not just survived the fire. I had mastered it. I had walked into the lion's den and walked out completely unscathed. I was financially secure, professionally successful, and finally surrounded only by people who truly valued my worth. The cost of raising a disappointment turned out to be the exact price of my absolute permanent freedom. Sometimes the heaviest debts we carry are the ones we never actually owed. For years, I was conditioned to believe that my worth was tied to my compliance and that standing up for myself was an act of betrayal. But the truth is, love should never be a transactional weapon. The greatest lesson I learned from dismantling my toxic family is that boundaries are not acts of cruelty, they are absolute acts of self-preservation. Manipulative people will always use your empathy and the heavy weight of family expectations to keep you trapped in their false narrative. They will project their own failures onto you and demand that you pay the price. But facts do not bend to gaslighting. Whether it is tracing a fraudulent financial ledger or recognizing a clear pattern of emotional abuse, the truth is always there if you are brave enough to look at it without flinching. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm, even if those abusers happen to be your parents or your siblings. True security comes from financial autonomy, emotional clarity, and the courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. You have the right to audit your own life and cut off the connections that drain your spirit. Have you ever been handed an emotional bill you did not owe? Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with the people who were supposed to protect you? You are not alone, and your freedom is worth the fight. Share your story of reclaiming your peace in the comments below. If my journey to uncovering the truth resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about breaking toxic cycles. Remember, the cost of their disappointment is nothing compared to the undeniable value of your independence.